I could not believe what I was seeing. I could have filled the back of his head with 5.56, which is an absolute joke.
Well, it's not an ape, because if the Sasquatch was an ape, we would already have one.
What are these elusive hominids that stalk the wilderness? Your host, two-time witness and field researcher for more than 40 years, William Jevning. Welcome to the mystery. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Creek Devil. Tom and I are going to do something a little bit different this week. We've had some scheduling difficulties. There's always a little bit of issue because of everything that's going on with COVID-19 and all. Sometimes people can't make the recording date when we try to do that. So, having said that, we decided to do some interesting things. There are questions and comments from shows up to a year ago. Unfortunately, there's so many comments with all the shows. We don't get a chance to address them, but we've been working hard to try to do that. So, having said that, that's what we're going to do with this segment. So, Tom, do you want to start off with some of the questions on your list, and I'll pull mine up as well?
Yeah, I do. And I'm going to start off with our last episode, which was episode 71, which is a real popular one. And that was Joe talking about the encounters that he had in Oregon. But one of the more interesting ones that he had was going out and hiking in an area that was really off the beaten path. And then him and his hiking partner had gone down and they discovered a set of waterfalls, turned around and came back 10 minutes later. And in the middle of the area, and we posted the picture on the website, they found a woman's hoodie, a black hoodie with the word pink, the Victoria's Secret hoodie, was laid on a sapling right there on the trail where they'd just been moments, like 10 minutes ago. And the comment is we had more than one person ask us, is that the condition that he found the hoodie in? Because it looks too perfect. And that is exactly how he found the hoodie. I contacted him. He said, yes. Simply took a picture of it. He put his hand on the top of it. It was a little bit damp on top, and underneath it was perfectly dry. So it had really just been placed there. And the possibility that there was anybody else in the woods was probably less than nil to none, because they were in the middle of the winter. It was in an area that, like I said, it was inaccessible. So that was, I want to thank the people who've brought that question to our attention. Yes, that is the exact condition. And apparently these things, well, we don't know. It caught Joe's attention, and it was in an area where there's a lot of activity in this area. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that area's had quite a bit of activity. So, until we get more information on it, I'm not sure what we can comment on it other than, yes, that was the condition it was in.
Well, okay, so that does kind of bring up a question, a logical question, and that is, have we heard of behavior associated with these creatures similar to that, where they do leave either whether they've left human clothing or something related to people on a trail, or have we ever found caches of human belongings that would be associated with these creatures?
Yes, on both counts. The first one I'll address was a situation we had. For those who listen to the show regularly, remember when Lee was on, he and another individual, and I believe they'd gone through that location before, so there was nothing there. They went through this same place in a relatively close time period, and they found a pair of women's panties hanging from a tree limb or a twig. What was it, about head height, I think?
Yeah, that's what he said.
So that's one example. Another one, the cache was in Colorado from a gentleman who used to be part of our group, and they were up in the middle of nowhere. There was in an area where there was a lot of Bigfoot activity, and they actually found a cache of all sorts of human belongings, just sort of in this spot, and it's not a place where you could drive to or anything. They had to hike quite a ways in there to get to it. So, and it wasn't a homeless camp. It was just sort of miscellaneous stuff. So those are two examples.
I want to go back and I want to talk a little bit about the last example where he found the cache of all that stuff. He had mentioned that the cache went back through, I think it was mining equipment and surveying equipment that could be dated back to the early 1920s, clear up into, and I don't remember whether it was in the 80s or 90s. And there was you could almost like, catalog historically this. Is that something that you remember him talking about?
That's actually a different situation than the one I'm referring to.
Okay, all right.
The guy that I'm talking about was, and I'm not sure, he probably still is a deputy sheriff, and they were working in an area that had some activity with these things, and they came on this stuff, and he got a hold of me, and he says, I found all this stuff up there. Any idea what that would be from? And I had heard this in other cases, so I said, yeah, they will take things periodically, and apparently that's where they put them. Wasn't necessarily hidden or anything. It was just in sort of a small ravine, but there was a lot of, everything from tents to, you name it. It was in there.
In other words, it wasn't a single source. They didn't just raid.
No, it was numerous, many numerous sources.
Yeah, okay. So they didn't just ransack one area. And then I'm going to go back real quick and comment on where Lee had saw the women's underwear. If I recall correctly, because he was hiking with his girlfriend at the time, they had literally not been there moments ago, and I don't remember if she saw it put it there, but the branch was still moving. It wasn't windy. The branch was still moving, and she was absolutely adamant that they leave the area. And I think I recall that Lee wanted to go out and kind of investigate, and she was having none of it. Right.
Here's one that I want to bring up. We were looking at some of these comments. This was from a year ago, and it's really a fascinating one. The name on the comment was Rusty Riddle. So if you're listening, we'd really like to hear from you on this one. That's very fascinating. He says, I was a timber faller in Aberdeen, Washington, and I fell some real big cedars and firs, and in the early 70s, in the upper Queets River, a hunter by accident found 2 bodies in a big spruce tree. He didn't know if they were hikers, timber cruisers, or hunters, and the sheriff's office went out and said it was a bear attack, which others and myself knew was BS. I knew the deputy, and he told me, and if I said anything, he would just deny it. He said they found 22-inch tracks, apparently Sasquatch tracks, but decided to call it a bear attack. They didn't want to scare the public. And I can tell you about the Queets River, and then, the Quinault, and then the Hoh Rivers are 3 areas that run basically east-west on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State on the west side. Lots of Bigfoot activity up there. And again, Rusty, if that's your name, get a hold of us, Tom at creekdevil.com, and we'd really like to talk to you about that area and what you know of that situation.
Yeah, that's interesting. The fact that there are people in the tree, but that, again, we're going back to this is not one-off behavior. This is behavior that we have seen with animals. They'll put deer in the trees, they'll put other creatures in the trees, and this is not mountain lion behavior.
No.
They don't do that.
And I actually have gotten a couple of other stories, not confirmed yet, but a couple others where supposedly people were found up in trees. And there simply isn't any other thing that's going to do that.
Yeah. Well, there's no purpose to it. And not only that, it's an incredible expense of calories to get somebody up in a tree, and haul a body, any kind of a body up in a tree, but especially a person.
Yeah, typically bears and big cats will, they make shallow graves and will partially cover a kill. They don't, at least in North America, they don't haul them up trees like they do in Africa.
Right. And you and I looked at a picture earlier this year. Actually, it was one that my brother sent me of a deer that had been partially buried. So if you're in the woods and you see that, it's an excellent time to have 1,000% situational awareness.
Yeah, you want to leave that spot.
You want to leave, and you really should be hiking with some bear spray and an air horn at a minimum.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a good safety tip there.
Don't become.
John wants.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I just had a question here. John wrote in and he says, "How do the Bigfoot rogue males find mates?"
Well, I think it's instructive to look at what other large primates do. I was reading about gorillas, in fact, just a couple of days ago. Groups of gorillas will live in groups up to 20 members. And there's sort of subgroups within the groups, and it kind of arranged by age. And it talked about how, and I hadn't read a lot about gorillas for years, so it was kind of interesting, new information like that. That oftentimes the females will actually go out, so there isn't a lot of inbreeding within a group, and mate, and possibly, the males are out there and they'll start other gorilla groups. But so the Sasquatch is probably like that. I mean, who knows whether the females go out and find males, or maybe males. We had a situation not long ago in Southern Oregon where there were 4 males who kept aggressively approaching this. It was a farm, wasn't it? You know the situation?
Yeah, it was.
About?
Yeah, it was a ranch.
And they hadn't done this behavior before. They'd been around that area for a long time, but this very aggressive kind of behavior. And it sort of struck me as maybe they were, trying to maybe raise their position within their group by, acting aggressively toward these humans. We don't know, it's speculation. But that's why a lot of primates, they'll do things to make themselves, look more important in the group to attract female attention.
Right. And that's, even, humans do that. Anything you can to
posturing,
improve your posture and boost your stature. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
You get good results from that. At least
Sometimes.
I hope you do. Yeah, right. Oh man. So we've got another question here, and I like this one. And Will, you and I have talked about this in the past, but it's still I think it's an excellent question. And for our new viewers out there, it's great to be asking these questions, and it's good to review this information. It has to do with fire as a safety measure. And you talk about at the Clark Ranch, and I love this story. You'd build a fire that could be seen from outer space. Did you feel that was a deterrent? Could that be a deterrent?
We felt it was the only option we had. We'd gone so far back, away from the Clark home, that there was no way we felt safe to try to get there at night. So, when all that activity started happening around us. So we had a fire going, of course. And I just felt it was my gut that said, build this fire up. We needed a light. We didn't have great flashlights. I don't know what it was when we were teenagers. I swear, I think we were just anti-flashlight. We never seemed to take them with us or have ones that, were very good, or maybe we just didn't have the money. I don't know. I don't remember. But we were good at fire, so we did that, and we felt that it actually acted as a very good deterrent.
Yeah, I imagine it would. This is because it's, I don't know. I think it just shows the creatures that this is something capable of creating fire and intelligence, sophisticated, and something that they need to be wary around.
Well, here's my thought. When my thinking is, and I've heard a lot of accounts over the years, obviously, and oftentimes, and from other good sources, that these things like to move in undercover. So if they won't, in other words, they won't do things usually out in open fields per se, things like that. They'll use the terrain and forest and shrubbery and things to conceal movements. When we built the fire up, it made a lot of light, and that was the whole part of the idea, was lighting the area up very well so we could see what was going on. And I think that was the main deterrent, because we could clearly see in quite a ways around the camp with that bright a fire. And I just think they were staying out of that so that we wouldn't see what they were doing.
Yeah, and we also have had guests on in the past that were in a situation where these creatures were very, very present and being aggressive. But they, as I recall, they created a perimeter of small fires around them. And I don't remember if it was 3 or 6 of them.
3, I think.
Okay, 3 of them. All right, yeah. And that acted as a deterrent. The creatures did not... They don't like to go within, the circle of flame or whatever it is that they can be seen.
I know I've experienced it, and I've talked to many other people who have had the experience where they would come up to the edge of the firelight at a camp, but wouldn't come any closer at all. And I've never heard of an account where they did come in closer.
Now, that's interesting, and I think I wasn't on, but I remember you interviewing Lee again, and where they would come in, and maybe he would be camping like 2 or 3 days in the same area, not making a lot of noise, and then you would just see them come in, and he said as long as you ignored them, they might stay there for a little bit and watch you. I'm not sure that's really my objective.
Well, I've been out plenty of times when I'm pretty sure they were around, could hear things. And of course, for me, I'm trying to keep them there so I can observe what's going on. So that's where I sort of come up with that, ignore them, and it kind of bugs them if you ignore them. They seem to be a little bit more apt to do things if you ignore them.
Oh, is there an escalation in activity, or?
Not so much escalation. It's just like if they're trying to be quiet, then they quit trying to be quite so quiet. You know what I mean? Not being overtly loud, but you'll hear things more than if you were standing there and being hyper vigilant. Watching all around you and appearing to be very alert. The trick is to just you're there. Okay, I'm going to ignore you. And you're not bothering me, so that seems to perturb them. So,
oh, okay. And I wonder if also it's almost like a not quite an invitation, but they can move in a little closer and investigate and see, why you're not.
And it does seem to be the case, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. If I ever want to go out and actively. Not provoke, but bring them in. I'll keep that in mind.
Just don't become the ham sandwich.
No ham sandwich. I'll just leave a big bag of those outside the camp.
I mean, you want to be cautious anyway. I mean, put yourself in a position where they don't have easy access. In other words, where it's a concealed route to where you are, be out in the open, and have things that would deter them, set like a fire or, like you said, the air horns, things like that. But
and numbers.
And numbers, that's the big one. The biggest one is numbers.
Okay.
A group of people, then you're much safer than, one or two people.
Yeah, and within that group, I would have a set of rules that you really don't want to go out and venture outside of your camp alone.
Absolutely.
Whatever the reason, you want to have two or more with you.
Yeah, you got to be smart about it.
Ron wants to know, Ron from Louisiana has a really interesting question, and he's talking about the odor that is sometimes reported by witnesses, and he wants to know if that could be the result of an injured or a sick Bigfoot. And he says that oftentimes sick or dying animals do emit a noxious odor. What's your opinion?
It's possible, but I suspect when they're sick or dying, they're like a lot of wild creatures. They're not going to be just out and about. They'll go someplace, and the rest of the group is probably going to be, they're not going to be out close to humans. In other words, what I think the odor is, and I've been pretty close to these things and didn't smell an odor. Other higher primates have scent glands, and they emit those strong odors when they get excited or under stress. So I suspect that's more what happens when people smell things than any other cause. Is
okay.
Maybe the presence of a human, agitates them to the point where those scent glands are triggered, or they're marking something with the scent glands.
Yeah, and I think I've heard you mention in the past that actually the percentage is pretty low. It's like 15 or maybe as low as 10% of the encounters.
I think John Green said it was very low. It was something like 7. Or no, I'm thinking eye shine. But the odor frequency was actually very low.
Yeah. Okay. We've got a gentleman in Tony from Australia. Thank you, Tony. We've heard from you in the past, so he has excellent questions. Tony's question is, why don't these creatures use fur and fur, et cetera, of animals that they kill for warmth? Or is it that they're primitive and they just don't need the extra protection? In other words, are they just kind of in a class by themselves and they don't really need to kind of take the dead animals the animals that they kill and make clothing out of them?
Well, I think it has to do with the fact that they're very well adapted, to the environments. There's actually, there was one other gentleman who, I think it's a gentleman, could be a woman, that talked about having a couple of dogs, and I should probably read this. And I'm going to spell these names because I'm not familiar with the type of dogs that they are. This person says, this was a year ago, comment, and this was in, I think, we were talking about, Sasquatch's hair and this very type of question. And I think what this person writes may answer this question. This person says, I'm a former skier, racer, taught high-altitude backcountry survival and canine search and rescue. Own both. Now I'm going to spell this because I don't want to butcher the pronunciation, and I'm not familiar with it. It's Spinone Italiano, and I'm sure that's some kind of a breed of dog. And the other one is Bouvier de Flanders. I'm not familiar with those type of breeds, but anyone familiar with dogs, may know something. And we'd like to hear about, if anyone's familiar with this or this person who wrote this. But anyway. Both dogs are bred for cold weather. With I'll just say Spino. With the Spino, there's a thick layer of fat under the skin acting as insulation, although still have clear muscle definition. The Spino has a double coat, with a thick outer guard coat being hollow hair. The Bouvier has a thick double coat, downy undercoat, thick, long, rough, harsh guard coat. Both coats adapt to seasons via shedding or growing a thicker coat. Adjusting to regional weather, they're comfortable in all but sub-zero Arctic conditions. Hominids certainly also have the ability to adapt to weather seasons, sans clothing. Vascular fat accumulation, adjustments, and metabolism. He says polar bears, Alaskan sled dogs, and Arctic wolves all have adapted and flourished in cold weather. And he says, or she, by the way, William, we've encountered 3 crossing on Route 4, about 3 miles west of Whitehall, New York in 1974, prior to the more famous sightings in 1976. It occurred at dusk in late November. Large male came out of the canal wet. Southern side, I was heading east, heading to Killington. I slammed on the brakes, but passed its crossing point, disappeared up a wooded slope. Northern side, looking in the rearview mirror, I saw 2 more quickly follow, possibly smaller female and another juvenile, question mark. Lighting was poor looking back. The first one was huge, 6-7 feet tall. I never saw an animal or person move so fast or graceful. Event happened between Comstock Prison and Whitehall. No houses, no reason for any human being to be out in that area. Cold, dusk, wet out. Did stop at Whitehall dinner, mentioned to the staff. They looked at me like I was crazy, mentioned it to Whitehall cop. As I was leaving, he looked at me the same, perplexed. Me for years. Moved out west the next year, so missed the Whitehall publicity that happened afterwards. So that was it for that. But, with the dogs, and he mentions, and then, of course, other animals live in the Arctic. And then there's also, looking back at the Ice Age, obviously, when the Ice Age happened, not everything was ready-made for it. Animals adapted to that kind of weather, and these creatures obviously have adapted to many kinds of environments.
Right, and haven't we discussed that the creature has a higher dense bone and muscle density than people do, considerably higher? Yes,
and that plays into it. Plus their size, that's also being very large, very thick-bodied, and upright. Being bipedal actually saves heat because you lose it through the top of your head and your shoulders, but not the rest of the body like a quadruped would. So it's actually it's a little better designed for colder weather. But the weather certainly doesn't seem to bother them. They don't seem to have any need for any covering or clothing or shelter even.
All right. Okay, so here's a question from Mary. Mary wants to know, and I like this question, there's nesting bedding areas that people have found. Do you think these Bigfoot return to these areas on a nightly basis when they are in the area?
I don't think they go back to the exact same places every night. Like other predatory animals are very cautious about other animals, other creatures. So, as a survival mechanism, they move fairly often. So I don't think they use the same places over and over again.
And you and I have recently we looked at a video on chimps. Chimps will make a nest, but they will never go back to the same nest twice. And I think I don't remember. I think that even said that they sometimes, or maybe as a habit, will tear up the nest when they're finished with it.
Yeah, right.
So, wouldn't be unreasonable for these creatures to do the same.
You're going to find similarity, sure.
Yeah. Okay, here's a good question. Do you think the cinnamon color Bigfoot are more aggressive than the regular patty types, or are they the same? Where are the color of hair? Okay, where the color of hair, is it just a stage that they're going through? And so he says, I hear certain encounters of the orange, brown, or cinnamon Sasquatch being more aggressive towards humans.
I don't know that hair color has anything to do with that. It could be an age issue. I think John Green, he mentioned that more than 70% of the reports were of the cinnamon brown color. During my first encounter, the two creatures there, they could have been cinnamon brown. I don't know. It was just, I could see part of the because the lighting the day was really bad. It was dusk and it was getting towards dark. So coloring, that time of day everything looks kind of black and white. There was a little bit of light on the leg, and I could see brown hair, but it could have been, in full light, it could have been cinnamon brown. But that's the majority of the color reported. Younger ones tend to be black, and the younger they seem to be jet black. There are gray. I have seen a grayish white. It wasn't really gray, and it wasn't really white. It was it could have been dirty for all I know, but that was what I saw. Not as many. Those are much fewer. So, but in terms of behaviors, the behavior's kind of across the board. There's not really, now the variations have some different behaviors, some more than others, but that's in different parts of the country. But coloration doesn't really seem to be a factor in behavioral aggressiveness.
That's what I was wondering, was the black ones tend to be the younger ones, so they're probably not as experienced and not as aggressive yet.
Yeah, unless they've got an attitude, then it could be really aggressive. So
right.
I guess it depends.
Right, exactly. Well, and even a young one would probably be more than a match for a strong man.
Oh, absolutely.
Even assuming the parents weren't around to finish that off. But
I mean, when you look at an adult chimp is as strong as 4 6-foot tall men. So I'm sure one of these creatures could hold its own quite well.
Yeah, I bet it could. Okay, so Todd wants to know if, and by the way, he's been binge listening, so thank you, Todd. That's good to know. We're holding your attention. He has a great question. Have anyone ever known a Sasquatch to be rabid?
I've never heard of an account like that, and I'm not sure how we'd know.
Right. And I think that'd be actually a good question and I remember talking to my veterinarian about rabies some time ago, and she was explaining to me how I was asking her why some animals may not necessarily get it, like marsupials, but mammals are much more susceptible. And she kind of paused and thought about it, and I think she was kind of going in the direction of body temperature. And I couldn't remember whether the marsupials have a higher or lower body temperature. So I don't know. That's a good question.
It's a good question. It is an unknown. But like I said, I don't know how we've known if you had an encounter where it was frothing in the mouth. And then again, is that rabies or is that something else? I mean, there's just no way to know.
Yeah.
But I've never heard anything that would indicate that.
And I'm not sure that it really matters, because if they're ticked off, rabbit or not.
You're right. You get a couple pieces of bread, you're it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And, that kind of brings up a question when we don't have any way of really knowing for sure. But when people do go missing and, you can kind of speculate that it has to do with these things, there's a fair amount, I think it's a good mixture of both men and women that go missing.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any kind of statistics. I mean, you have to do the research to see what the statistics say. But that it could also mean that if it's men, are there more men out doing those kind of activities, or the reverse? We just don't know. You'd have to look at all the different variables, to come up with some kind of a formula for that.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so we have a question here. He doesn't leave his name, or she, but since the Bigfoot creatures and humans are both bipedal, why is it that humans leave footprints in a left-right catty corner, kinda, but when a Bigfoot leaves prints, they're in a straight line, almost perfect straight line.
It has to do with the mechanics of your hip. Their hip is
And I've
designed
wondered
differently
that.
than ours.
It's got to be, because I have tried to, like on the living room floor, just kind of mimic 1 foot in front of the other, and it's very awkward, and I would never do it hiking in the woods. It's just,
I'm sure
it's
we
not
could
going to work.
I'm sure we could get our forensic anthropologist John to talk about that. He'd be very familiar with that, but I do know it does have to do with hip size and shape and everything and placement.
Yeah, it is interesting, and it's a very good question. And that's one of the things you notice when you see the Bigfoot trackways, is it's one in front of the other.
It's one of those pieces also that if people say, well, it's fake, it's people doing wooden feet and things like that. While those things could be true, they wouldn't know to make a gate like that, because they would have people faking these would have no knowledge of that. So
Right.
How would that be a consistent find?
And especially in the early days, when
Yes.
a lot of the footprints were found, and they were found in a straight line, and then you could tell when somebody made plywood cutouts, and of course they were side by side, not
and those lines of tracks were in the thousands, and they'd find them going up and down all sorts of horrible terrain. I know Renee Hinden told me about many of the times he was on these track finds, especially in Bluff Creek, and the type of terrain. I'm familiar with that area, so I can just imagine finding all those tracks and all that terrain. You simply couldn't do that with wooden feet in the 1960s. It wouldn't happen.
Right. I've driven through Redding and Red Bluff, which is just I-5 going in Northern California. Yeah, that is some very rugged country.
And you're talking a spacing. Everybody likes to call it stride, but just the spacing between each foot. The gap from where one footprint ends to the beginning of the next one. In other words, the end of the toe to the heel. Oftentimes it was around 55 inches. Do that going up a hill or down a hill with plywood cutout strapped to your feet. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, good luck with that. Exactly. Yeah, and we've heard people talking about when the creatures walk, it almost looks like somebody cross-country skiing. It's not heel to toe, but it's just flat, flat, flat.
Well, they sort of pick their foot up and move it across and put it back down. It's sort of, the mechanics work like that. Even though when you look at the Patterson film, it kind of appears like the way we walk, but it's really not.
Right. And the Patterson film, of course, it's there's a little bit of instability or jerkiness, when he's falling from the horse or whatever. So we don't get a real prolonged. Even when they stabilize it, it's
because when we put our foot down, we put it down heel first, and then our foot rolls, and then we toe off. The Sasquatch doesn't walk like that. Picks its foot up and then it puts it straight back down. The bone structure is completely different, or not completely different, but it's quite a bit different than ours.
Yeah, so it's almost as if they're actually more suited for their environment, for an outdoor environment.
That kind of bipedal walking is much better suited than ours is. Ours is actually not fully developed. Going back to my ancient anthropology days. In the 80s,
okay,
where they talked about, the professors talked about that, how one of the reasons we have so many joint and back problems is because our mode of locomotion is not fully developed.
Right.
So we tend to have a lot of trouble with that. But these creatures are much better. It's why they move better than we do.
Oh yeah, and I think about, we interviewed Wynn a while back, and we've talked to, I think, some other, Mike in Maryland, how the creatures will walk almost like a spider. And it was described as looking like on somebody on a mechanic's creeper.
Oh, when they're on all fours, right?
Yeah, you're right. When they're on all fours, which is something we couldn't, begin to mimic.
Yeah, we're not really designed for that, so we're pretty awkward actually in our movements.
Right. So if they were to watch us during the Olympics, they're like, "Oh, get out of here! I do that all day long."
Yeah, right.
So these are some really good questions. I want to just point out that the easiest way to get a hold of us is you can just shoot an email to questions, plural, questions at creekdevil.com. You can email me, Tom, at creekdevil.com. And Will, do you want to give out your email address if they want to get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can get a hold of me at either williamjevning@yahoo.com or wjevning@gmail.com. Also, I wanted to mention before we go on the monthly newsletter. I'd mentioned this before, I think even last week, that for a long time we talked about the newsletter and had a lot of problems actually getting it into production. So that isn't a problem anymore. We're doing that monthly. So if you want the newsletter, doesn't cost anything. Just sign up for it at williamjevning.com, and we get that out once a month to everyone. So if you'd like that, go to there and sign up for it.
Yeah, and also creekdevil.com. I'm getting it set up so that you can also submit to newsletter at creekdevil.com. And so either one of those, you'll get the newsletter.
I have a question here from, it's again a year ago. Sorry about the late questions on some of these folks and the answers to them, but it's Gary McNeil. He says, "Hi, Will, I have a question or two. Would be very interested in your thoughts on the subject. It seems that most everyone feels a Sasquatch knows what a gun is. How so? How does it recognize the look of a gun? Could it be fooled by a replica gun or a pellet gun? Could it be the smell of gunpowder that alerts it to the fact that a gun is near, or to the fact that a gun is near? Any thoughts?" Well, these things are very observant of humans, since we are a threat to them and have been apparently for millennia. So they've obviously seen us hunting, shooting at each other, doing all kinds of things with guns. So I think they're very keenly aware of what a gun is. But also, most objects, if not all objects, we have in our hands. Things we do are very destructive, whether it's chopping trees down or what have you, things that they've observed. So I think they're very cautious when they see a human holding something in their hands. They take the ground that it's harmful and that it's a weapon. So hope that answers that question.
And actually I think that's an excellent question. And I think about how any animal responds to something in your hand. If you go to a stranger's house and they've got a dog that hasn't seen you before, the dog is going to focus on your hands. And if you have something in your hands, the dog's response is, that's a danger. That's a weapon. Or and cats are the same way. They just, you're not going to get bit. But
yeah.
And so I think all animals have a lot more intuition about something in a person's hands as being a potential source of danger than maybe we might initially give them credit for. So if the lower animals do, you can bet these things do.
Well, that's a good point with dogs and cats and other animals. I know, growing up on a farm and have had plenty of pets over the years. Animals always like me, so I'm one of those kind of people. They just kind of instinctually, when I first moved here, Julie had a bull mastiff, and she was always very concerned. She said the dog doesn't like men, so I said, "Oh, she's going to like me right away." She says, "Oh no, she growls and stuff at men, but likes women." I walked out in the backyard. First 5 seconds, dog come up, starts wagging her tail, and she buddies up to me right away. She says, "How did you do that?" But my approach with animals is always open hands, with nothing in them. I turn them up, palms up, and let them smell and lick my hands, and you make friends pretty quickly. But Yeah, animals seem, if you got something in your hands or your hands are a certain posture is a big thing. So yeah, exactly. I'm sure they can see that, and especially, like I said, they've watched us do things for many, many, many years, and we're not to be trusted, I think, by them.
Right. And, people, just again, going back to just the pets and the animals, I don't think we always give them the credit that's due for their intuition and again, picking up on posture, and they seem to have an instinct and an intuition about whether somebody is, like you, they can go right up to you and immediately you make friends with them because you know how you're comfortable and familiar around animals.
And especially with these things, primates are the most intelligent animals on the planet. And I've mentioned this a number of times in the past. Everybody oohs and ahs about, dogs and whales and so on. But primates are a gulf higher on the level of intelligence than those animals are. And people can argue that all they want to, but that's the fact. And these things are probably a hominid. So they're even a little notch higher on the list. So they're going to be keenly aware of what's around them, what potential threats they face, and so on. So, I have another one here from a year ago. There's some of these folks, if you're listening, we'd really like to hear from you. This is one from Hensley's Hobbies. It was a year ago. He said, I had heard another story similar to yours. I'm not sure which one, if it was my account, but except this middle-aged man had or owned an excavating company or heavy equipment company or something like that. Anyway, he and his wife owned a good parcel of land which their house was on, and where they kept all this heavy equipment. Well, somewhere just down below this shop or equipment building was an old quarry, and part of the quarry was filled in with water which made a small lake. Just above the quarry, on the back side of it, was nothing but woods. Well, to make the story a little shorter, he and his wife had been in this place for I don't know how many years, and nothing ever happened. Then one day he had noticed a lot of footprints around all of his equipment and his shop. And one set of prints were huge. Well, that went on for a little while. Then he started noticing some things had been moved around, including was either a backhoe or a front-end loader. I don't remember which. But that piece of equipment wasn't started moved. It was shoved over a few feet. Then after a while, he and his wife started hearing screaming and hollering coming from the woods just above the quarry, just about every night for a while. Then, well, he saw this huge hairy thing standing up on the ridge above the quarry. But anyhow, that's all I remember of that particular story. See, that was a while back, too. You just reminded me of it when you were telling your story here. Very fascinating. We, again, would love to talk to you about that, and especially if you remember any more details from that story.
And, and that's not unique. We have heard stories, credible stories, where these creatures have come in and actually moved heavy equipment around or knocked it over.
Well, Tom, now one of your relatives. Now let's talk about the earth mover tire from the Bluff Creek area. Go ahead and tell everybody about that.
Right. Okay. So this was my uncle, and it wasn't him. It was his parents down in Happy Camp, and this was back. This kind of ground zero where a lot of this got started for this topic, and what it was they would use a road grader. They're right after the war, and they're just starting to make roads into the forests and do the logging. And the swampers would come along and pick up the debris behind it. Well, they would also park this tire, a spare tire for the road grader, up against the road grader every night. It made no sense to haul it a whole hour down the hill, then back up every day. So they just lean it up against the road grader every day, and if they needed it, there it was. They came up the next day, and the tire was gone. And where did that thing go? Finally, they found it on the opposite side of a ravine. It had not been rolled. It had not been dragged. It had been picked up and thrown on the other side of the ravine. And some of the guys who were swampers were actually had lived in the area. They were I think members of one of the Native American communities there. And he said, the idea was the foreman said, well, we need to go down there and hook up a cable to it, and we'll drag it back up with the crane or something. And that wasn't going to happen with these guys. No amount of money in the world will get them to go down and hook it up. But that tire, I think he said it weighed around 300 pounds. So, interesting story.
And it was, and I think even John Green wrote about that in one of his books, and it was in the same area where, the 55-gallon drums of diesel were tossed around and some pretty big culverts.
He actually told me about that, about the diesel drums being tossed around, and some of them, I think he had even said, had been moved like a long ways into the forest.
Yeah, I met one of the guys on that crew, back in the 90s in Vancouver, Washington. And I didn't get a chance to really interview him. It was sort of, we're out in public, and I don't remember even how I chanced upon the guy, but we got talking, and he said, yeah, I was one of the guys on that crew that found that stuff. And he said it was no BS. He said it really happened. We knew what did it. I'm pretty sure he said there were footprints all over there, and he said we were pretty spooked. None of the guys wanted to go back up there.
Yeah, well, that's what my uncle said. He said they were absolutely, totally freaked about this, and because you just sit there and you look at, and the barrels were full of either diesel or old motor oil. So what does a 55-gallon drum full of motor oil weigh? A lot. Right? A lot,
yeah. Well, I'll tell you something. Again, it goes back to my old college days. It's good to have some of those pieces of information as reference. I took an oceanography course once, and they talked about water. Water is probably one of the most densely compacted substances on the planet. In other words, it can't be compressed any more than it already is.
Right.
And 1 cubic meter of water weighs a ton.
Yeah.
So I think a cubic meter of water is probably pretty close to what would fit in a 55-gallon drum.
And just pick that up and haul it through the woods.
Yeah, you're talking. A 55-gallon drum of liquid is at least 600 pounds, and up, depending on the liquid, of course. So for something to have the strength to pick something like that up like it's nothing and walk off with it is pretty incredible.
Yeah, and he said they were not rolled through the woods. They were picked up and carried. So I don't know if that was a demonstration of look at who we are. Who knows? But,
who knows, right?
Yeah, he said they were just, and a lot of guys, after the tire incident, when they went back to camp, signed their papers and said, I'm never coming back, and they didn't.
Finally, it's good to hear someone else describe something similar to what I saw in upstate New York. I relayed my experience to another YouTuber who never replied to my question. What I saw was jet black, moved with an odd fluidity, kind of like Gumby. At first I thought it was a bear until I saw its profile. It was so black I couldn't see its eyes. No protruding nose or ears visible. The head was round, ball-like. It was on all fours and looked around frantically. It did not even see me, though I was no more than 40 feet away. There was a loud crashing in the woods. Something large and heavy was chasing it. That's kind of spooky. I'm not sure how to address that.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to be around something that freaks out a Bigfoot.
Exactly. I mean, he gives a very interesting description of something that's not a bear. That's very likely one of these things, but then something is chasing it.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't want to meet that.
I don't think I would either. Do we have any more questions, Tom? Or
I think that's it for now. Again, I just want to thank everybody, as usual. The only wrong question to ask is the one that you don't ask. So we appreciate it. Excellent questions. Keep them coming. Again, questions@creekdevil.com.
And the folks that post things on, our YouTube shows, if you've had an encounter, get a hold of us. We'd love to talk to you about it. I know I see people post things occasionally on there, and I'd really love to address, what you encountered. And of course, we guarantee your anonymity and for both your name and locations if you wish that. So, and I don't think we've ever really given out last names anyway of people, and if they'll say, well, don't mention my name, or we don't have to say a name at all even. And we've done that a number of times. But we'd really love to hear from you. And even if you don't want to come on the show, we'd still like to talk to you. Alrighty. Well, I think that'll do it for this segment. Everyone, stay tuned for the next segment. We're going to do a Q&A. Welcome back from the break, everyone. Before we kick off the Q&A here, I want to let everybody know that I'm going to be recording for a show called Beyond Reality Radio this coming week. I'm not sure when it airs yet, but keep your eyes open for that. So, getting started, Brian, we're going to let you kick things off.
Yeah, I had a question about DNA, because we talked before about how there have been blood samples obtained that have DNA, and it always comes back as unknown primate or unknown specimen. But my question is, what if they were to keep that sample, and then they got other blood samples from other creatures that also came up with the same, unknown primate? Could they compare those and then say, hey, this must be a new species?
Well, my understanding is there's a couple problems there, or issues. One would be storage, and I'm not sure what the cost of storage is when it's in police labs. Of course, they have the budget for all that, and things stay indefinitely, normally, unless there's problems where things get lost. But with something like this, I don't think they save the samples because there's no, official organization behind keeping it. At least I believe that, and if anybody's out there knowledgeable about that, let us know, because I'm not totally certain about that, but I'm pretty sure they don't keep the samples. But on the other hand, if you had multiple samples that came back unknown primate or unknown, you probably could compare them. They might say, oh, okay, these are all from the same type of creature. We just don't know what it is.
Guys, can I jump in real quick with that? Excuse me, with a comment or a question on that, and that is, and actually this is to the audience out there, if we have anybody that's listening that has a background in this topic, if they would like to, if they would like to just contact us and we can talk off the air, we'd love to do that, and always keep your identity confidential. But also if somebody's out there and they would like to come on the air, even if they want to come in, under, either an assumed name or a name that, we don't mention, but discuss the topic, we would really appreciate that.
And another thing, too, about that, for anybody that's listening, not just about DNA and blood and stuff like that, but also from a psychological standpoint, if you have a theory about how these creatures behave and some of the things that they do in terms of relating to people and other wildlife, we'd love to get some expertise on that, too.
Good point, Brian. One of the things I'm interested in, and I've been sort of away from the field of psychology for a lot of years, I'd like to talk with someone, not just about the creatures, but more importantly, human reactions to, situations that might come in front of them that they have no frame or reference for, and the effects on their mind and their recollection. So I'd really like to talk to somebody, who's qualified in that field.
Yeah, and Will, would you also maybe theorize too that somebody's experience with one of these creatures, it could almost be compared to like a war situation, like PTSD almost?
Absolutely. Tom and I were talking about there's a term called tachypsychia, and there's some other combined effects along with that one, but that one's where time sort of gets affected in the person's mind. In other words, the stress is so great that it actually causes, in their minds, time delays and things like that. So, again, that's something I'd like to talk with maybe a clinical psychologist about, or maybe somebody who's dealt with PTSD, extensively, about the effects of a high stress situation on the person's mind and the kind of things that might be added to their experience that didn't actually exist, or the brain's coping mechanisms, what they would replace in that situation to try to answer the questions that their mind doesn't have answers for in that circumstance.
Yeah, and I'm really interested too in that note, in terms of like how many people go through an experience, and then like what percentage of people are willing to tell others around them, like close people around them, and also the percentage of people that are reluctant to say anything because they just don't know what they saw, or they're just kind of scared to talk about it.
Yeah, there's some very interesting psychological things that go on, surrounding these accounts that would be interesting to find out.
Will, I want to follow up on that a little bit. I guess the trauma I kind of want to go back to your very first experience, because your first sighting was you talk about being outside of the frame of reference. You had no frame of reference whatsoever. Do you, I'm kind of a loss for words here. I guess the question is, how would you categorize your initial sighting as traumatic, and maybe you comment on that? And was it long lasting?
Well, I guess you could say it was definitely a WTF moment. I did have a minimal frame of reference, though, because we found the footprints 2 years before. So, and a little bit that my friend John's dad told us. So, when I walked through that, those low-hanging fir branches that were there, and just walked in on that situation, that creature was standing there, the first response was, what the hell is this? And time did slow down significantly. I mean, everything around me seemed to stop. My mind, of course, was racing to figure out what the heck is in front of me. And in your instinct for survival is what really kicks in, I think, at that moment. You're trying to answer the question, but also your mind is also working on, what's my next course of action? What do I do? Because it's such a imposing feeling of dread and threat in front of you, that close especially. So instantly, my mind was thinking, okay, I'll shoot in the air and see if maybe that'll scare this thing away, because there's no other course of action I had except to run, and I didn't want that thing grabbing me. The other portion of that thinking at the same time was, oh, this must be one of the things that made the footprints we found a couple of years ago.
And then you had, and you kind of got a double portion, because after you fired in the air, then you got the other one came in.
Yeah, there were two there. So the other one was behind me. Okay.
So and you've talked about this before, but just for people that maybe are just tuning in or just have, this is new information for them, did it have a long-lasting effect?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, occasionally. I mean, it's been 45 years ago, and I still, every once in a great while, will have a nightmare about that encounter.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, to the point where it'll wake me up in the middle of a deep sleep at night.
I can imagine. And then you also had an encounter where don't know if it was a Goldilocks one, but you saw it across the river while in a vehicle, the big one.
Yeah, that's the encounter.
They're all big.
That's the encounter everyone wants to have. You know, where there's a natural barrier between you and the creature, but you're close enough to get a good look at it.
Right.
It wasn't very long, a few seconds. You know, it was standing next to the river edge, and then it, when we came into view, it grabbed a tree and up off in the timber it went.
Now, you also had, I think, 2 other encounters that were not really real up close, or I don't know how to phrase it, maybe a significant or sighting. But one was while you were working, or while you're at station at Fort Lewis, and then another one, I think it may have been at the Clark Ranch, where somebody threw a stick up the hill.
Well, I categorize these encounters as either, there's all sorts of people out there that have all kinds of different ways of classifying things, trying to make themselves look important or like they know something. It's either you have a direct encounter where you see one face to face or closely, or in some kind of proximity where you get a good look at it. And the other one is a peripheral account where you don't see the creatures, but you hear things, there are things being interacted with you and your situation. So there's been a few of those peripheral ones. The Clark Ranch was one. We heard them pretty much all night long, screaming, doing stuff around us. One of the guys was pulled partially out of the tent. One of the guys did see one of the creatures. So that was fairly unnerving. And I'm the kind of person that I don't react emotionally in those high, very tense situations, high anxiety kind of a situation, because I'm concerned about the people around me. So I'm reacting logically about what to do to get us through that situation. I can take a deep breath later once we're all safe and, then process the emotional part. But, and that's what I've done in every one of these situations. So, but at Fort Lewis, yeah, that was, I took my RTO with me, and poor kid, he didn't have the night vision goggles on, so he didn't see what was in front of us. So, and all I saw was a big shape, and it was, I can only say it was vaguely man-like shape. In other words, it was tall, it was fairly wide, and it moved from my right to my left, like taking a sidestep. And my skin got instantly cold, and it was an automatic response, and I just in my gut I knew what it was, and I just started moving backwards and telling my radio man, out, get out of the tree line, and rallied the squad and decided to sit in the road. And then the guys said they heard something in 2 legs walking around us, and one of the guys said, "Hey Sarge, you're from here, what do you know about Bigfoot?" So anyway, and then of course the incident you referred to with the stick being thrown, that was a group of 10 of us that were out, and John's younger brother threw a rock where nobody knew what was going on, and the thing must have been right there watching us the whole time, because it was almost an instant response. He threw the rock out. A few moments later, this long branch come flying back in horizontally, from the brush in front of us to the middle of the group.
And that takes hands.
It takes hands, yeah. We've been out plenty of times where, rotted tree limbs have fallen and things like that. We were very well aware of those kinds of things that happen, in the forest. Being kids, we spent lots of time out in the woods. So, but when something comes flying in, it was probably, around 5 feet long, this branch, and it come flying in from the brush out in front of us, probably 20 feet, completely horizontal.
Wow.
So it was being thrown at us.
Yes. And didn't you run up the hill?
We did.
And you turn around and you saw these things ransacking your camp?
It's what it looked like, yeah. Yeah, all
food
these
supplies
dummies, all these dummy teenagers went running up the hill, towards the direction where this branch had come. And it was apparently some kind of a decoy move, because our goodies got ransacked.
And a quick follow up on Fort Lewis. You just saw movement. Would that have been like Gen 1 night vision? You could see stuff, but it's not really crisp.
That's when the ANPVS 5 night vision goggles first came out. That would have been around 1980 or 81, and we had just gotten them, and they gave me one to go out and try out, and so I was wearing it. It was when the Army gets brand new things, they're pretty sensitive about them. So only certain people can utilize them to get feedback on. So I was the only one that was allowed to handle the thing and use it. And we did things like I'd put the whole squad, I had a 15-man squad, and have everybody in a single file line holding onto their web gear on the back. And then I would lead the procession up and down hills and things like that in the middle of the night. So it worked well, much better than the old Starlight scopes they had in Vietnam, obviously. So, but it still wasn't as good as what they have today, of course.
Oh, okay, that was my question. Was what was the clarity like? I've looked at the Gen 1, the old, probably I'm sure it was the old Starlight scope, and you can see stuff, but it's hazy. It's really good for detecting movement.
Well, the PVS 5, of course, that was passive light source, so it wasn't projecting any kind of IR light or anything like that. So, when you get in where I went in, excuse me, I set the squad up we were practicing ambushes. We had no aggressors that night, so nobody was anywhere near us. They were miles away in all directions. So I set the guys up along a road, and I don't know, it was the middle of the night sometime. No idea what time it is, thinking back on it, but it was late, and I took up my position with my RTO in between the two fire teams for command and control. So I picked a spot that was under a big, actually there were several, I think they were cedar trees, so it was pretty dark in there. So what the ANPVS 5 picked up was more shape and movement. It wasn't real clear. But I think that early version of it, was pretty good capability. It was much better than the previous versions of night vision.
Hey, Will.
It was enough to motivate you.
It scared the crap out of me.
Hey, Will, did you tell Renee about this? What do you think?
Well, those guys were kind of funny. I did tell him, and he's just kind of, that's interesting. We didn't have... I don't know. I mean, at that time, I don't know what he was collecting in the way of information. We chatted about things. He said, "Oh yeah, there were stories around Fort Lewis and all that." It was just in the course of conversation. It wasn't like, "Hey, Renee, guess what?" A lot of times we talk about things that I was doing in the field, and then we discuss comparisons, to the area and other things that had gone on and things like that. So he wasn't the guy that would ooh and ah over a story. It was, very matter of fact, give you comparisons, that sort of thing.
Speaking of Renee, did he ever have any kind of friendship with Titmus, or?
He and Titmus did not get along.
Oh, why is that?
Well, I think the genesis of that problem was when they had the Pacific Northwest expedition that was funded by Tom Slick. And Titmus was put in charge of it, and Renee thought he should be in charge.
Oh, okay. What about Green? Did Green and Titmus get along?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they were good friends.
Oh, okay.
Green actually sold Titmus a house, and they didn't live too far apart.
Oh, okay. Going back to the what you call peripheral encounters, when you think about it, the scary thing is that most direct encounters probably don't get reported to anybody in the first place. And I imagine that peripheral encounters are even more that way. They probably never get reported, or very, very seldom, would you say?
Yeah, I get a lot of emails from people who, listen to us talk on the show and realize that they very likely did have some kind of a peripheral encounter. And then they'll contact me and say, well, this is what happened. And sure enough, it does sound very much like these creatures were just out of sight, but interacting with them.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you about, because people are probably familiar, or a lot of people are probably familiar with the Teddy Roosevelt and the Bowman story, but have there, to your knowledge, been any other, I guess, politicians or just, I guess, leaders in general that have talked about the subject besides Teddy?
Well, you have to understand the Teddy Roosevelt story. That was in a collection of stories in one of his books. Wasn't necessarily presented as any kind of a Bigfoot story. He presented as a ghost or goblin story, from a local person in the area that he talked to. As far as I know about other politicians, not that I'm aware of. I mean, there may have been. I'm just not aware of them.
I've got a question regarding missing animals. Oftentimes we hear about if the creatures come into an area, cats and dogs, pets will start missing, chickens, livestock, that sort of thing. Have you heard of situations where you start to see kind of an upspike, almost like an escalation or a exponential spike in the missing animals, and have that associated with the creatures in the area?
I've looked at that quite a bit, actually, and get a lot of reports of that. There's always, animals that disappear. Having grown up on a farm, it's something that's just sort of, it's taken for granted. You know that things are going to happen because there's wildlife around the area. And if you have livestock and pets that vanish, either you just automatically assume that something happened to them, something got them, whether it's coyotes or what have you. But and we had I remember chickens for a time, and then weasels came in and killed them all. So my parents decided after a couple times of that happening, they weren't going to have chickens anymore. So we grew to expect things like that, and I think a lot of people that live in rural areas do. But when I get reports of Sasquatches being seen in areas, I'll ask people, has there been an increase in pets and livestock come up missing? And almost universally the answer is yes.
I remember an episode quite a while ago where somebody was on and they're talking about they would go to a town, and this is little peripheral towns, small areas in probably California, Southern Oregon or Northern California. And there were the telephone poles or the bulletin boards would just be plastered with missing pet posters.
Yeah, it's like you have the normal amount that come up missing. And I don't know what figure you'd put on that. I don't think anybody keeps track of that. But, there's always, you always see signs up with people, have you seen this, this animal, please call, whatever. But then all of a sudden there's an increase. And it surprises some of the people that contact me that'll say, all of a sudden there was just a lot of animals come up missing. And then, of course, we get reports of these creatures being seen at that time. Yeah,
so you got a baseline, like you said, everywhere you go, you see a missing poster for an animal here and there. But when it jumps exponentially, that could be an indicator.
Yeah, I think in that case, you could probably, and I don't normally like to, do 1 + 1 = 2, making those logical line of thinking, this happens, then this happens, so, we can attribute it to this. But I think in these cases, it's a likely scenario that we can go with. I think it's probably okay to make that assumption.
Well, let me ask you this: when a creature does attack, say, a pet or something like that, is it because they are targeting them, or is it, do you think that maybe a dog is very brazen and tries to go after one or barks like crazy at one? Do you think it might be kind of a kind of a, not a defense thing, I guess, but just hey, mind your own business, and tears them to shreds?
Well, it could be I'll give you a scenario. We've had people we've talked to where there be, a number of houses along a tree line, and, with the creatures in the area that either have been seen or tracks, and then there's the dogs that kind of give their position away when they hear them moving out in the tree line. And it could be that they're getting rid of the dog because they don't want their movements to be alerted to the people living there. That could be one scenario. Could be just they're, irritated with the dogs barking and just get rid of them, or they're eating them.
Yeah, because I know we'll probably talk to Pam next week from Legend of Boggy Creek, and there's a scene in that movie where a cat kind of gets scared to death, and it's implied basically that the creature, if it wanted to, it could have ate the cat, but it wasn't really interested in that. But like you said, it might be just it's just kind of bothering their path, basically.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I do remember that scene, and I can have or provide a related experience. The same guy who was grabbed out of the tent at the Clark Ranch incident, he lived in the town of Roy, and they had these very heavily built rabbit cages on the backside of their house, and the rabbits that weren't taken and torn to pieces in the yard, they were eaten. The only thing left was the hair. There were some in the cages that were frightened to death. They just died from shock.
Yeah, it sounds very pretty traumatic. We got a listener who has a question, and that was, we've talked about the four basic types of this creature, but I think you've mentioned that out of the four basic types, there could be as many as 22 subcategories.
Slight variations.
Slight variations. Okay, variation in species. So he wants to know. He was wondering if any of the four types interact with each other, and if so, just speculation. What kind of encounter could that be?
To my knowledge, no, they don't really interact. Which goes back to, if they were interacting, then you'd have probably more inbreeding, and there wouldn't be, the variations like there are. So they seem to kind of stay in their own areas, and they do overlap occasionally, but they don't seem to interact.
That was a question I had about overlap, not only within different species, but what about, do you know anything, because I know you've had pretty good success. You tracked 3 groups up in Washington for over a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know anybody else who's able to go out and kind of use their knowledge and on demand go find the creatures like this.
It was a lot of work.
So, yeah, right? Is there any overlap between the same species, but are there territories? In other words, could you have one in territory A, that group moves out of territory A, creates a vacuum, and another group might move in maybe just long enough to realize the food's gone, but nonetheless still be in the same area?
Yeah, they overlap their ranges. And they don't seem to have a lot of friction, and that could account for some of the vocalizations we hear, just saying, hey, we're over here, you're over there, and it kind of prevents that friction where they can move, freely throughout those areas without having those conflicts.
Yeah, and that kind of makes sense because, we've talked about it in the past. The friction can result in conflict, and conflict will almost certainly, if there's injury, can lead to, it can be a fatal thing over time.
Correct.
And I think that also probably applies, I'm just thinking in terms of mountain lions. I'm not familiar with, and maybe there's a biologist out there who would correct me, but I'm not familiar with mountain lions having, negative, friction amongst themselves.
Yeah, I think most species are fairly well regulated within themselves, in terms of, now some will try to push another one out of their territory, but there's usually not a big conflict. It's more show than anything.
Hey, Will, would you say that I'm sorry, actually, the opposite of most sightings are not of the alpha male, right? Would you say?
What was the question again?
I said that of the sightings that get reported, most of them are not of the alpha male of the group, right?
Well, it's difficult to say, but I would guess that, yeah.
Why would you think that, though? Like, why wouldn't the alpha male show itself first?
Well, I think they surround themselves with submales and other members of the groupings. So they're probably, farther away, probably with females and young, rather than being out exposed to the threats.
Brian, that's actually an excellent question, because we do hear almost invariably the vast majority of the sightings are not of the alpha male. It is of probably one of the, I don't know if you want to call it a sub-alpha, but something that's probably in between the
submales.
7. Yeah, okay, submales. One of the smaller ones. I mean, it could be, 7 or 8.5 foot tall, but it's not one of these 10-foot creatures.
Now, it's guesswork, of course, at this point. But sometimes, the behavior tells us different things about maybe where that individual belongs in the group. And a lot of times the indication is, and I'll give an example, the 3 groups that I tracked. The alpha in the Western group would show itself sometimes, but there was that one, there was a female and 2 young ones, so it was a smaller family unit. So the male was obviously the alpha of that group by its behavior, and it would expose itself more often and would keep the young hidden, and the female occasionally would show itself. But the alpha was more often in that case. Now the 3 males that are sort of the central group, the alpha, there was an alpha of that group, and that's the one we saw, the big gray one. And I think it had an offspring. It was close to its size, but the coloring was different, and the appearance was younger, at least by witnesses who saw that one. But in that case, the alpha didn't show itself like the other 2 members would. The Eastern group, that one stayed pretty much out of sight most of the time, so I didn't have a lot of details about that one in terms of behaviors, but they're a little more aggressive, that group was.
I got kind of a follow-up question on the groups. Sometimes I think you've mentioned that groups will temporarily join together. So maybe you got a small group of 3 to 6, and then they will bond together. And there's been some pretty significantly large groups. I'm just curious, again, speculation, but one of them, I guess, is what is the purpose of that? And the other is how would they determine who is the ultimate alpha of all those groups?
Well, I'm sure in a group like that, or that kind of a situation, and we know it is temporary, there's probably a hierarchy among the alphas even. We can see that when 2 groups encounter each other, one alpha is going to be more dominant than the other one. There was a case where, witnesses heard that, the groups interacting sounding very much like 2 groups of chimps encounter each other, where there's a lot of screaming, a lot of this display, and then one of the alphas roared or made its presence known through vocalization, and then all the screaming stopped, and the 2 groups passed each other peacefully. So obviously one of the alphas was more dominant than the other one.
Will, I have an interesting question, and I guess this might sound odd, but would there ever be a situation maybe where instead of an alpha male, there would be the alpha female, where she would be the leader of the group? And the reason why I say that is because I know that in the orca community, for instance, the mother is the leader of the group. I mean, the matriarch, even though she's smaller in size. So I'm just wondering if there could ever be a situation where in the Sasquatch community where a female might be leader of the group.
It's unknown. No evidence, for that either way. I would say you'd have to compare a situation like that to other primate species. I mean, do we see that? Do we see that with gorillas and chimps and orangutans?
Yeah, interesting question. And I don't think anybody's out there with a clipboard doing a census on these things, interviewing them.
No,
so.
Not likely.
I got a question here. We got one of our audience members. He wants to know, why hasn't a Bigfoot been caught in a trap yet? He goes, I know that they're very intelligent, but nothing's immune from getting busted once in a while. And he said he didn't want to see anything killed, but do we know of any is there a conceivable situation, or do we even know of a situation where any of these things have been captured or caught in a trap?
Well, not in a trap. I mean, you got to remember again, look at other primate species, what they do. They're very wary of things that don't belong in their environment. If it's not something that's in their house, then they're going to be pretty spooky around it, especially man-made objects. So if you go out and build a trap, they're going to know exactly what you're doing, and they're going to steer clear of it. So my answer is no.
I just wanted to come. Yeah, okay. And believe it or not, there actually is a trap in Southern Oregon that, I don't know how the guy did it, but he filled out all the permits and paperwork with the Forest Service, and so I guess they're under some sort of a obligation to go in and periodically hike in and check the trap.
Yeah, I think that's
the
right.
Trap.
Ron Olson built it in 1972.
That's it. Yes. And it has caught nothing but tourists.
Well, it's a tourist trap.
It's a tourist trap. That's exactly what it is. And you look at this thing, and all it is a wooden box with, I think, a spring on the door. And nothing is going to take a look at that and say, I think I'm going to go in there and, check on the raw meat in there.
I'll tell you what, I can think of a couple instances off the top of my head. Witnesses told us, in one case, Dalton, in fact, they were out target shooting, they built, and these guys are Army, special operations guys, so they built an extremely heavy target base, and were shooting at it, so they know what they're doing. And one of these things came in and tore that thing to pieces in a matter of minutes. Another case was Lee. They had that very heavily built outhouse in Southern Oregon, and that too was completely torn apart in a short order. So looking at the picture of that trap in Southern Oregon that Olson built, if one of these things went in there, you're sure not going to keep it there long, and to tear that thing to pieces and would be out.
Yeah. I don't know if it was like, 7/8 plywood, but whatever it is, it would last a nanosecond.
Well, creatures that are capable of, twisting and snapping 3-inch trees, with ease, are going to tear through a man-made object like that with, little effort.
Yeah, it'd be a hot knife and butter.
Hey, Will,
what about...
Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, what about, and this kind of points to people who try to catch these things, not to capture them, but to capture them on video with a choke point or something like that. Again, it points out the part of the reason, I think a huge portion of the reason that trail cams are ineffective with these things. It's a man-made object. They know it's there, and even if it's a great distance away, I'm sure that they, and plus it emits IR, which we think they can see.
And they might be watching you place it there.
True. Yes.
Hey, well, let me ask you about when one of them dies and what they do with the body. What are your thoughts on that? Do they bury it, or do you have any theories or thoughts on that?
Well, that's a good question. From Native American sources, there were a couple of directions on that one, and I'm not sure of either one yet. One is that they were not just Natives, but some other folks also reported seeing these things, apparently burying a dead one. Other sources say they would eat their dead. Do they do either? We don't know. There have also been reports of bodies being found just out laying, a couple instances, one next to a lake, partially decomposed. One in Northern California here, I think it was the 60s, on a place called the Warner Ranch, where a couple of young girls found one apparently dead, partially decomposed on an old logging road. So,
wow. And didn't you say that there's a site somewhere too where people say that there's a whole bunch of them buried?
I don't know about a bunch of them being buried. I know of a bunch of locations on the coast, at least a dozen different sites where there could be burial sites. I just haven't excavated them. Yeah,
that's an interesting question, Brian. And it also kind of points to the rock mounds. You know, you have talked about not the rock mounds, but the, for lack of a better word, just the holes where these things have gone in and dug a hole in a boulder field for some purpose, for an unknown reason. But I think there's also, you've mentioned that there's rock piles in very, very inaccessible areas.
Yeah, they're never close to, Renee DeHinden put me onto these years ago. John Green actually did a story in one of his books, and where they went to the place where a logger said he watched these things stacking rocks. And so DeHinden, Green didn't do anything with it. It was just a, point of interest for one of his books. But DeHinden went out and actually looked at 7 different sites on the coast. He told me how to find them, and he said, well, because we got discussing it one time, and he says, well, here's how you find them. Go out there and, document them, and we'll talk about it. Let me know what you think. So neither one of us really had any answers at that time. I went out and spent quite a bit of time going to each one of those locations, and they were very difficult to get to. There was no kind of trail, road, or anything to find them. He had special instructions on how to locate them. And then I've talked to witnesses since then that have seen the same things. So we're talking all the way from, the Yukon area down through Northern California. So I know of probably a dozen or more sites like that. What they mean, we don't know yet, but we're going to be, investigating that further here.
And I just want to make it clear, you've mentioned that the rocks, the size of the rocks, these are not the rocks that a person could pick up and create these rock mounds.
A lot of times they're between 150 and 300 pound rocks.
Right?
Yeah, it's not so. If you're going to go hiking up in the middle of nowhere, and good luck getting to some of those places just casually hiking, let alone picking up those rocks and doing what they've done with them. Not to mention they were witnessed doing it.
Right. And also, I could see moving one rock, and then that'd be it for the day.
Yeah.
Not you by yourself, but maybe you and a couple buddies could possibly move one rock. For why somebody would want to do that, I don't know.
Yeah, who's going to see it?
Yeah. But do a whole stack of them? That's not going to happen.
And the sites that I've been to, I've counted as many as, in each site, 20 of these stacks. And sometimes they're piled. So what differentiates the pile from the stack? Unknown yet.
Okay. So and each stack or pile or whatever you want to call it has numerous rocks in it.
The piles do, and the stacks are usually 3 or 4 rocks in the stack.
Oh, really? Okay, so it's like a rock cairn of boulders. Sometimes
2, but usually 3 or 4. And somewhere I've got my notes about how many of the stacks had what number in them, per site.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's not just random numbers. These were specific numbers.
And again, the purpose is unknown.
It's absolutely unknown yet, yeah.
Well, Will, going back to the subject of them dying and death and everything, this is just kind of a pure speculation question, but one of the theories that I've had is that because keep in mind, this is not Harry and the Hendersons, this is not, these aren't benign creatures. One of the theories that I've had is that when one of them gets elderly and might be vulnerable and maybe a liability, they would say, I wouldn't be surprised if they would kill one of their members. And I just want to know what you think about that. And then also kind of the opposite, if a baby, like an infant, gets born And especially, the possibility of inbreeding and stuff like that. If there's some deformity, I wonder if they would just kill that creature as well. I mean, what are your thoughts on those things?
Well, from what I've learned, it seems like they take pretty good care of their own. I don't think they kill off. The only time I've been aware that they would, act that way towards another member of a group is if that individual, typically a younger one, maybe an older adolescent or young adult, would get out of line, with whatever internal behavioral, stations or rules there are within the group, and they would kill that individual.
Right, like maybe if he or she tried to challenge the alpha male.
Probably something like that, yeah. But otherwise, in terms of the young and old and disfigured, they seem to take pretty good care of their own.
Okay.
And speaking of disfigured, I think you said you've run into some tracks that have some pretty significant damage. Their foot looks like a broken toe or a torn foot.
Yeah, I've seen that. Plus, I have casts in my collection that have deformities. So yeah, I mean, you would expect that. If you're living out in these conditions, things happen. So whether it's a birth defect or an accident, they do occasionally get deformities.
Tom, that's actually a great question, because you think about it. I mean, these things are walking, hundreds of miles. Would you say, well, their range could be as much as 200 to 500 miles, perhaps?
The range in southern Washington is, 3,000 plus square miles.
Yeah. So imagine walking all that way in the woods, and you're stepping on things. So I imagine there are probably a lot of deformities in some of the prints that we get. And
there could be things happening, I'm sure, when they're hunting. You're killing an animal, deer, an elk, and certainly that animal's not just giving up easily. So I'm certain, feet are easy to step on or kick. You get a 1,000-pound elk, putting up a fight. You're could have certainly some injuries happen.
Well, I'm going to post two pictures that you had given me about a month ago. And one of them is the original footprint that was found up on the Himalayas. I can't think of the guy's name, but he was the first guy that discovered the Yeti print, the trackway. I think it was Eric Shipton.
Yes, Eric Shipton.
And what I found interesting was prior to, probably a couple months ago, you had mentioned that there was, on some of the footprints, the big toe and the little toe next to it are almost they're separate. They're kind of in their own little segment, and then the other three are off by themselves. You see that in this Yeti footprint, but what I really found interesting is one of the footprints that you have is actually from Washington State. I think we've talked about this, but it's pretty similar to the Yeti footprint. It's absolutely not at all like the typical Bigfoot Sasquatch footprints that are so common. The
toe orientation and some of the prints, the big toe is the same size as the rest of the toes. In other words, there's kind of a uniformity in size of the toes. And then some of them are very different. They're more like ours, where the big toe is much larger than the rest of the toes. And then again, like I mentioned, or you mentioned, the orientation, the first two toes, the great toe and the one next to it, are oriented a little differently than the other three toes. So there's some kind of a differentiation there, and it could be this, variation among species. Maybe it's a starting point of a division between, two different groupings within a single type.
And that's exactly where I was going with this. That is there a possibility that one of the subspecies or the species variations that is commonly thought of as the Yeti is also here in the Pacific Northwest, up in Washington State. Yeah. They just look very similar.
Yeah, I don't think there's a great separation between, the types, or those what's there and what's here. That's all the same creature, basically. We're just looking at the variations within a grouping. We'll have to get John, our forensic anthropologist, to address that more specifically sometime.
And Will, the interesting thing too about footprints is that, as you said, it's almost like a fingerprint. Like, you can tell sometimes if you're looking at the same creature, or you're tracking the same creature, based on the footprints will be exactly the same, different and unique than any other individual, right?
Yeah, just as good as fingerprints, because they all wear differently.
Now, how often have you come across where you see one set of tracks, and then maybe 6 months later you see the same set of tracks and you can tell that it's the same individual?
Oh, that's common. Yeah, you always know which individuals are where, or if it's the same individual, I mean.
And the I guess the accompanying tracks too. I mean, can you tell? I assume it's, if you find one individual, you'll find the other individuals of that group in the same cycle, right?
You can, if you search correctly.
And I guess that's probably a good way to determine if one of them perished, I guess, because if one of them is missing, then you know that they must have died. Well,
or it could be like, the groups in southern Washington. There were the group of the three males. Sometimes they would join with one or two of them would join with one of the other groups for a time. So, we'd find prints, and then there wouldn't be, these additional individuals with that group. So instead of them perishing, it may have been they just separated back off, and the three males went on their way and doing whatever they were doing, and then the group that they had joined temporarily with went about their normal routine.
Gotcha. Now, about height, there's some formula where you can kind of determine, or I guess guess or speculate a creature's height based on how big their prints are. Just in general, how many of these creatures that judging from the prints, are over 7 feet tall, would you say? Or even 8 feet?
Of the adult prints, most of them. I mean, the formula that John Napier came up with was the overall total length of a foot, multiply that times 6.6, and then divide 12, of course, 12 inches, and that gives you a height estimate. And John, our forensic anthropologist, said that's actually a very good formula, and it's pretty close, pretty accurate.
Just remind me too, in the audience, how big was Patty's prints?
About 14.5 inches. So that's usually the lower end of adults, and they estimated that creature was around 7.5 feet, and I think that's what the formula, off the top of my head, comes to. And then, of course, tracks typically range 14 to 17 inches for adults.
Okay.
That's the average. It can be a little bit more, but that's the average.
Now, do you think that Patty was full grown at that point, or?
I think so, yeah. Because that same creature's tracks were found, that was 1967. DeHinden told me the same creature's tracks were found near the Oregon-California border in 1980, and the track size was exactly the same.
And would you say that's kind of average height and print size for an adult female, or was Patty maybe a little bit shorter or a little bit taller than most females?
Well, we don't have that much information on females, so that was kind of unique because it had two witnesses, it was on film, they had all the prints. But I would say overall, just, and the estimate, I don't think track size is really any different between females and males, but it could be, but we don't know. But the average footprint size is 14 to 17 inches. That's the overall average.
Okay. Now, obviously, Patty's sighting was during the day, but it seems like most sightings and encounters are at night. Would you say that overall the species is pretty elusive? Is it mainly because they travel at night, or is it that maybe the paths that they take to maybe that are away from humans? Because they travel mostly at night, would you say?
Well, not so much travel, they're feeding. And that's when a lot of the game animals are up feeding, so. Everything has to do with food.
Well, I can relate to that. Yeah, and I just want to comment, right? Well, and it is important for people to remember that when you see one of these creatures, what's it doing? It's probably looking for food. And if you see any kind of wildlife, it's probably looking for food. And even going down to the plant kingdom, if you want to refer to it as that, they're looking for, survival, propagation, and getting nutrients. But I just wanted to comment on getting back to the footprints for a second. The majority of the footprints, a lot of the ones that I hear are actually, they start at 14 inches, quite a few of them. And you do the math on that, it's just a little over 7.5 feet tall, 7.7 inches, 7 foot, 7.7 feet. So, okay, we'll just call it 7.5 feet. That's pretty significant. You think of the size of your average ceiling in the house from floor to ceiling, that's 7.5 feet. It's a big creature.
Yeah, and look at the majority of reports. People, obviously they have to estimate height unless it's next to a fixed object that they know the height of. And typically the height ranges, on average, 7 to 8 feet tall, sometimes upwards to 9, and in some cases greater, but typically 7-8 feet high, and that corresponds with the majority of tracks that are 14, 15 inches long, 16 inches.
And you can't forget, not only is it the height, but the incredible bulk. At least the ones in the Northwest are just very, very large, bulky, and muscular.
Yeah, and actually, speaking on that note, not the Pacific Northwest, but the Fouke monster, when they first saw it, when witnesses first reported it, they said it was about 7 feet tall, maybe a little bit taller than 7 feet, but only, they said about 250 to maybe 300 pounds. And then later on, when they saw it, they're like, no, it's a lot bigger than that. So a lot of times people get their guesses wrong, I would say, because later on they estimated it was at least 600 pounds, and it was, very, very bulky. So
and that's a good lead into, or we're just about out of time in this segment, fellas, so that's a great lead into what I'm going to talk about for the third segment. The story is a fascinating one. The accounts were real. It took place in the 1790s in France, and people listen to it. It's a fascinating story. Don't jump to conclusions. There's a lot of people who are predisposed to, making judgments about this particular story. The woodwose was very commonplace in that part of Europe for, who knows how many hundreds of years probably, which was, hairy man-like creature. This one they use the word wolf a lot, so I know people will jump to conclusions that are predisposed to Dogman and things like that, but in that time period especially, people were not very well educated, and they would talk about things or use the reference to what they knew. So listen to the story. It's a fascinating one. I think it has more to do with these creatures than but people put in a lot of their own thoughts and beliefs to what was attributed to actual events. So, fellas, any final thoughts before we move on to the next segment?
No, just a reminder to anybody out there that if you had an encounter, let us know. You don't have to necessarily come on the show, but we always love to hear it. And if you have any questions, keep them coming in.
Yeah, and you can reach us. The easiest way to contact us at any time is just questions plural at creekdevil.com.
And also, we've been getting the show out on different platforms, so it's on iTunes now, folks. So if you want to listen to it that way, take a look there. And Tom, I know you're going to put that on the website, the link. So with that, I think we will end this segment, fellas. Everyone, stay tuned for the third segment. It's a fascinating story.
The Beast of Gévaudan, True Story of a Monster of France. La Bête de Gévaudan was a real wolf-like monster that prowled the Auvergne and South Dordogne areas of France during the years 1764 to 1767, killing about 100 people, often in bizarre circumstances. Every effort to stop her failed, and she became nationally infamous. The king, Louis XV, took a personal interest, partly because she caused unrest in an area of tension and potential revolution. Many explanations, mutant, prehistoric beast, etc., were put forward at the time and during the 2 centuries since, but none has ever been generally accepted. The important, firm fact is that sufficient evidence remains to prove La Bête really did exist and was not just a myth. Among all the popular monster mysteries, she was unique. She left behind 100 bodies, proving herself real and guilty beyond doubt. This article gives a balanced view on La Bête, about whom surprisingly little has been written outside France, where she remains a household name to respect or ridicule, according to choice. We always laugh at what we secretly fear. The true tale of La Bête de Gévaudan is like a Shakespeare play. Loving a plain woman or being a member of Parliament, the more you put in, the more there is to take away. A greater depth of information than has previously been available in English on her career is therefore offered, all based on recorded facts and including no fiction. The French rightly claim their wine and this mystery as the world's best. You can drink more deeply of either at a price. For wine, the price is only money and a headache, but the price for La Bête is never again to feel quite safe walking alone in a sunny country lane. In France, she is quoted as the greatest enigma of history. Prowl on, but do look over that left shoulder occasionally. And little maids all in a row. On at least 5 occasions, beasts rumored to have been La Bête, ranging from large wolves to a baboon-like animal, were killed, but in all cases except the last, a not very formidable deformed wolf-like creature killed in June 1767, she recommenced killing shortly afterwards. For example, on September 16, 1764, a wolf known as Le Loup de Pradelle was killed and assumed to be La Bête. She took only until the 26th to kill a girl at Tort and prove the assumption wrong. Following the death of a little girl on an unlucky 13th, only her bonnet and clogs were ever found, La Bête was reported shot in an abbey estate by a M. Antoine as Le Loup de Chazé on September 21, 1765, but was seen at Marciac on the 26th, 27th, and 28th of that month. She started a new 2-year killing career on December 21st, the shortest day of the year, and a long, silent night for little Agnes Morgay. The winter wind hit a very sharp bite indeed, and that Christmas cost Agnes more than the usual arm and a leg. Quote, insufficient remains for burial, unquote, not enough to fill even a small stocking. La Bête had herself a merry little Christmas, and stopped the carol singers from making their usual killing, because nobody dared open doors barricaded against her. Snowy New Year 1765 yielded, for example, the head of little Marie-Jean Rosset of Milanets, recognizable only by her staring eyes, everything else being cleanly gnawed away. One poor woman, over 60 years old, nicknamed La Sarabande after the triple tempo Spanish dance, could find no grass for her cow, her only possession, because of the deep snow. She led it to a marshy area where sometimes a little greenery penetrated through. La Sarabande's body was ambushed for 3 days, but La Crafty Bête did not return. She liked marshy areas because her agility and relatively light weight enabled easy escape from mounted pursuers, whom she often deliberately led into mires and left floundering. Even the local men liked playing this trick on the arrogant and gaudily dressed dragoons they regarded as a costly nuisance and useless for pursuing La Bête. One father and son, Antoine and Jean Chastel, everyday country folk, were in fact imprisoned for it, possibly in the cellar, still to be seen, of an old school in Souge, en route to the dungeons in Mende. They misled some hunters, proudly led by a royal huntsman wearing king's uniform. Guess who ended up sitting on his horse, stuck in the mud? The Chastels might have gotten away with it, had they not threatened him with a gun when he complained. Another attack with an agricultural theme was that on a farmer who rose early and started scything his wheat harvest by moonlight. He saw a movement coming towards him, but the animal itself was hidden by the tall wheat stalks. His first thought could well have been that it was one of the farm dogs coming for a fuss, but it proved to be La Bête coming for his blood. He managed to fight her off with his scythe, but on arriving home was unable to speak for 4 hours, being paralyzed with terror. One typical attack occurred at dusk, locally called, quote, the hour between dog and wolf, unquote, on September 6, 1765, at Estrettes. A woman was tending her humble cottage garden, amongst her garden shed, when La Bête seized her by the throat, beginning with her usual apéritif of blood, sucked, not stirred, and did not cease until neighbors armed with axes, sickles, and forks arrived. The woman died, but La Bête, having enjoyed her liquid refreshment, lived on. Another woman, a servant, going to Mass at Escurès on April 29, 1765, saw La Bête and tried to delay her because men were approaching fast. She paid for her bravery by losing face, throat, and life. There was the mysterious case of the 3 women of Pompirac, going to church near the wood of Favard, when a dark man offered to escort them through the wood. They refused, and before leaving he touched one of them with a fur-covered hand. Dragoons, arriving on the scene, warned the terrified women not to go into the wood, because La Bête had just been seen there. 2 women of Escurès, also on the way to church, had a similar experience in an area where, unknown to them, she had just been seen by several people. This time they saw that the man accosting them was covered in fur only when his shirt blew open in the wind. It was said at the time that La Bête, instrument of the devil, was trying to stop them from going to Mass. As with all good monster murder mysteries, there has to be the wicked aristocrat solution. In this case, he was supposed to have hidden among the nuns of the Abbey of Mercoix, the abbess of which was known to take contributions from fugitives. This solution to the La Bête mystery is ridiculed by serious students of the subject, but perhaps he did exist. There are other instances where appearances or attacks by La Bête were associated with human presence, including a famous witnessed sighting from a cottage window by a stream in the moonlight. There were also the 2 bodies found roughly reclothed after death. Fact or imagination? The relationship of these occurrences to Robert Louis Stevenson and Brothers Grimm is referred to later. Scarlet billows start to spread. Too many horrors, another being what happened to Madame Merlet. She had her eyes scratched out, and La Bête spat a stream of her blood over approaching rescuers. No, toujours les politesses that time. On June 21st, 1765, the Witches' Sabbath, when the weather was warm enough for the naughtier country folk to dance naked round bonfires, she killed 2 people and savaged a 3rd. Was this yet more evidence of her apparent sensitivity to Gothic atmosphere? She was often reported in places with supernatural associations. Or did she just fancy a hot takeaway with no French dressing? Either way, she came back for 2nds and 3rds to go. Also in 1765, her busiest year, the case occurred at Cheval, where a father, a tenant farmer of good reputation, was bound and imprisoned by the fiery Captain Duhamel for failing immediately to report an attack to the authorities. He had delayed doing this only to attend to his child, whose larynx had been bloodily torn open, a specialty of La Bête, and to nurse his seriously ill mother. Many attacks remained unreported for fear of becoming involved with ponderous and ineffective bureaucracies, rather like on housing estates today. 6-year-old Marguerite Lebray was killed in front of 6 firm witnesses, all testifying to Curate Guilbegue at La Paz-Lossière, who also recorded reports of smaller, boar-like bêtes seen 3 days later. These records of sturdy porcine or feline beasts in addition to our rakish, wildly graceful wolf-like lady are too frequent to ignore and add another dimension to the mystery. Either way, as was affirmed by Denneval, the king's chief wolf catcher, the greatest expert on wolf hunting in France, La Bête was definitely no wolf. Another odd fact is that some measurements of distances between her footprints showed she could make leaps of over 28 feet on level ground. If true, this weighs in favor of the athletic build rather than the stocky one. Reserve judgment on this point. Perhaps the bravest struggle of the 3 most famous ones against La Bête, Portefaix, the schoolboy, Valet, La Pucelle, and La Femme Juvet, was that by the puny Madame Jean Juvet on March 9, 1765, at Fort-de-Brion, where she fought to protect 3 of her 6 children with only her bare hands and rocks snatched up from the ground. 1 child died, and Madame Juvet herself was injured. The king gave her a reward of 300 livres. The incident was vividly described thus. Quote, "The skin of his skull was falling to the right. His cheek was torn, his lip and nose torn away to the root. He died within 3 days. The same evening, La Bête devoured a boy at Chanelay and was seen again the next day at Estival. These events caused great consternation throughout Chez-du-Vent and Auvergne. The floor of one meeting hall collapsed from the sheer weight of people crowding in, trying to organize a hunt for her. There was the case of the girl, her little brother having been snatched from her, who bravely rushed into the wood after him and found him peacefully lying there on his back, apparently intact, but in fact lacking liver, entrails, and blood. The girl who cried to warn her sister, quote, 'There's a big wolf behind you,' unquote, turned and ran, only to see her sister's head bowling along the ground. The little boy who, on July 21st, 1765, went to fetch the family cows from their walled meadow near the village of Auvers, and simply never returned. At the time, La Bête was being sought locally by the wily aristocrat M. Antoine, the king's gun-bearer, who posted his hunters in pairs on paths all over the district. There has always been a question mark over his policy. Why did he post guards mainly at night, when La Bête usually attacked in the daytime? The first thing the searchers found was the boy's shoes standing in the road, then all of his clothes lying almost untorn in the meadow. Of the boy himself, nothing was ever found. Beast or human criminal that time. Enclosed meadows were particularly dangerous because the dry stone walls, with their mossy covering, similar to those of the Lake District, camouflaged her perfectly before she pounced. Jumping down from the top of walls and rocky outcrops was one of her favored methods of attack, especially dangerous to those tending flocks, who had built their fires up against them for a little more shelter from the Margide mountain winds. At least they died warm. It was said La Bête would plow straight through a flock of sheep, scattering them like leaves to get at the shepherdess. However, she was much more wary of cows, which were sometimes found spattered with the blood she had spat at them. Her lack of fear of fire, dogs, and people, especially women and children, but fear of cattle, are strange but consistent features. That so much detailed information still exists is thanks to Le Procès Verbal, or PV, an old and sensible French legal procedure often mentioned in Maigret-style detective films, where evidence is formally noted by officials in front of witnesses. There are volumes of them, often confirmed in church records of burial ceremonies, giving in detail La Bête as the cause of death, and signed by witnesses, priests, and other respected persons. One struggle against her is particularly clearly recorded by the curate of Basile. Another curate, Ollier of Losirier, got even closer to the action by bandaging a girl's wounds and making a measured sketch of a footprint which was similar to, but larger than, those previously recorded. Suspicious, isn't it, how so many churchmen occupied themselves with Libet, both before and after her reign? Or is it simply they were the only intellectual, literate, and socially responsible people present in every sizable village? This point merits careful thought by the conspiracy theorists. Her consumption of clerics was limited to one convent novice near Grezes in 1767. No priests, although she ate the cheek of a relative of Abbé Porcher, her most famous chronicler, whose house, by the way, with its strange bet-like carving on the door lintel, still stands. She liked her victims in skirts, but obviously knew la différence. The preference of Libet for women and children might have been simply because they were more readily available. They were the ones tending the lonely mountainside flocks in ones or twos, whereas the men did the heavier work in the farm fields, often in groups and armed with spades, scythes, etc. All parties were experienced wolf repellers and had only contempt for these cowardly nuisances. A few stones usually sent them packing, unless they were rabid, and if they were, their messy bites were nothing like the elegant surgical work of Libet. In March to June 1766, there were 14 attacks by her within 6 miles of Polalac. Not bad for a reportedly dead bet. Incidentally, the old village concluded its history tragically, being burned by the German army in 1944. It is perhaps now haunted by even sadder spirits than those of Libet's victims, who were killed by a hungry animal for food, and not for the politics of greed. First catch your bet. Many wanted posters appeared. For example, this one in August 1764, only slightly parodied, made a lot of profit for the printers. Quote, "Reward 12,000 livres if dead, known as Libet, but kills under 3 aliases. Reddish-brown with dark ridged stripe down the back. Resembles wolf/hyena, but big as a donkey. Long, gaping jaw, 6 claws, pointy upright ears, and supple furry tail. Mobile like a cat's and can knock you over. Cry, more like horse neighing than wolf howling. Last seen by people mostly now dead. If she approaches you, please leave behind a signed copy of this poster." Unquote. Many pictures were circulated, some very elegant ones from leading Paris art houses such as Basset, Corbier, Labelle, Millat, and Mondher. Even some from Germany. Prints are still available. From August 1764 on the king's orders, the world's greatest ever hunting aristocracy was ranged against Libet. With all of its resources of chateau thoroughbred horses from royal stables for the leading huntsmen, and for others, hacks from humbler stables, wearing darned Agincourt jackets and often rode to their deaths. There were specialist wolf, boar, and bear hounds, plus as many echelons of trackers, hunters, and master hunters as NHS management grades, but wasting less money, having no computers. She didn't stand a chance. Or did she? Note that no suspicious human footprints, sensibly shoed or otherwise, were ever found near a kill, although Libet's own easily identifiable long-clawed prints were there too many times, including all over the riverside mud of her famous fight with La Pucelle, the servant girl who successfully fought her off with a spear made from a spindle. These footprints, recognized on the spot by 3 leaders of different hunting parties, bloodstains, and supporting evidence from a 16-year-old girl witness, were all recorded in the procès-verbal, helping to confirm the incident as genuine. Contemporary pictures of the fight still exist, some simple, some stylized, as one would expect. One fresh body was found lying out in snow, with no tracks or footprints around it at all. Impossible, of course, but typical of the strange happenings high in the Margeride Mountains, a harsh region, which the locals describe as 9 months of winter and 3 months of hell. Regarding stories surrounding Libet, It is unlikely she founded the Plump Partners dating agency, but against the fiction or hoaxes, some admitted, there are 100 horrors, mostly with witnesses, graves, names, parishes, and dates as evidence. Grim facts and bloodless human body parts prove her existence, even if the more lurid tales are suspect. One indisputable fact is that Lebet did succeed, aided by bad weather and economic problems with the cloth industry, in dragging the region down to a state of poverty and famine. Women and children were too terrified to tend their sheep and cattle out on the lonely pastures, and the men were constantly called away from field work to hunt Lebet. The resulting neglect was sufficient to tip the scales of such a fragile economy into a decline. Louis XV and his court took her very seriously. She prowled a region where Huguenot-Jesuit tensions were acute, and the king feared she, plus the arms massing there, would ignite the revolution whose tumbrils were perhaps just beginning to rumble in the distance. Remember, the Gévaudan was part of the independent states, whose recognition of the French crown's sovereignty was not at the time fully ratified. Problems arising from the antipopes in Avignon and the Great Schism of 1378 to 1417 still echoed, and the city was not annexed to France until 1791. Although dissolute, Louis XV was not a king who killed more people than he had to. His nickname was La Bien-Aimée, but whether this meant he was well liked or he got a lot of his loving is subtly and Frenchly left unclear. Being king in those pre-revolutionary years must have been one hell of a job without the beast who is eating everybody making life even more difficult. Larousse, the main French encyclopedia, even in its recent edition, still states, the whole of France concerned itself about her for some time. The most dangerous animal in the world is the intelligent French female, and poor Louis XV had at least 3 to contend with. Madame Pompadour, Madame Comtesse du Barry, who dined at 5, copying the king, a politically significant fact according to Dumas, the Queen's Necklace, and Lebet, who also dined in the daytime, but less formally. One madame lost her hair, but Lebet kept hers while crunching many others. Unlike the curvy courtesans, she never embraced the fleshy king, who died from smallpox, 1 million little bites instead of one big one. His successor died of the biggest bite of all, la guillotine. So perhaps Louis XV did not handle French affairs, including Lebet, too badly after all, even if he did, aided of course by Madame Pompadour, bankrupt the state. The importance of Lebet in French history is virtually unknown outside France. Like BSE, they couldn't get rid, so each blamed everybody else. There is no lack of conspiracy theories, especially relating to the king's anti-Jesuit policies, which peaked in 1761, 2 to 3 years before she appeared. Certainly people exploited her for political purposes, but equally certainly, there was a real, dreadful entity conveniently there to exploit. Lebet's total effect on history was, perhaps, beneficial. If she took only 100 potentially revolting peasants' children's lives, but stopped war between Huguenots and Jesuits, later saving from la guillotine the aristos who were recognized as having helped starving peasants fight her, she leaves a moral credit balance. You never know. She might be canonized one day. Often, 2 or 3 versions are recorded of stories about her life and presumed deaths. There are, for example, 2 versions of the La Pucelle, the spindle-packing heroine story, when she was called upon by Antoine to identify the body of the Loup de Chazé at the Chateau of Bessette. One says she firmly refused to identify it as Lebet, the other that she did, but only doubtfully, from a wound on its shoulder, possibly made by her spear. There is more than one version of the Loup de Chazé story. One states it is genuine, another is fraudulent. Incidentally, the skin of this wolf, Antoine's kill, is said to have been destroyed by the National Museum in Paris only early this century, it having lost all its hair. Why would they destroy one of the most famous relics in all France unless it was, as many suspected, a fake, or, X-Files style, something people were not to know about, like the hieroglyphics on wooden tablets discovered in 1722 at the bases of the 593 giant statues on Easter Island. Controversy and mystery still follow Libet today, as persistently as she stalked her terrified victims 200 years ago. Goaded by the wrath of a king lumbered with a naked wooden rocking horse in his Versailles garden, awaiting her never-to-arrive skin, the desperate nobles were reduced to the argument that Libet could not exist because it was impossible she had escaped their mighty searches. She did not know this, so carried on killing. Can you be completely impossible and yet exist? Certainement, if you are French. Chastel's deformed wolf-like creature, shot at Saulnay-d'Oiviers on about June 20th, 1767, must remain as one but only one of the possible answers to the puzzle. Diagrams of its deformities, for example, of the jaws, still exist. If it was the solution, it was almost certainly contrived, and not the whole story, the remainder of which is said to involve human elements and various collusions. It is unlikely the popular Marquis d'Apcher, the leader of the hunt, cheated. It was not his elegant style, and cost him the best excuse ever to miss church on Sundays. Which would you rather do as a handsome 19-year-old marquis? Go to church, or gallop around rescuing grateful mademoiselle from the very jaws of Libet? Suspicion falls on others. This involved tale has already created a semi-fictional novel and more arguments than Liverpool Council. It is for smoky campfires on long nights. Keep an open mind. Incidentally, the gun which shot this creature was bought by Abbé Pierre Porcher at Saint-Julien in 1888, and he writes about hearing of its whereabouts from a woman on a train. He met her by chance, having entered her carriage, because he feared she might be molested by two unruly soldiers. In the Gévaudan district, wolves were often caught in deep pit traps, dug and concealed so the wolves fell in. Bait was sometimes scattered round the traps. Because people thought Libet could jump out of normal pits, very deep ones were dug, sometimes of complex structure, for example, octagonal in shape and interconnected by tunnels. The purpose of these is not clear. The bait was often unburied carcasses or parts of her victims, left out in spite of protests from priests wanting early and decent burials. She never fell for it. One desperate measure adopted against Libet was the extensive use of poison, sometimes applied across whole mountainsides. The king's wolf-catcher, Monsieur de Nival, the surly Norman squire, who had 1,274 wolves to his credit, 1,200 previous ones and a share of 74 while hunting Libet, was an early advocate of poisoning. This was after his hounds, the best in France and excellent trackers but more suited to the flat, open countryside of Normandy than the rugged, wooded Gévaudan, had failed to catch her. Another supporter of poisoning, at least for a time, was M. Lefont, the syndic, a very important local official, possibly the cleverest of all those hunting Libet. The chief poisoner was a M. Mercier. With his assistant, he was particularly busy during April and May 1767, buying live dogs, then poisoning them with very big doses to provide ready poisoned carcasses. The regional governor, Saint-Priest, finally ordered operations to cease because so many innocent domestic and other animals were dying, including the dogs providing the poisoned carcasses that killed even more dogs. A serious matter for the mountain shepherds to whom loss of their partners could mean starvation. Specialist poisons supposed to kill only wolves were formulated, but they didn't work, killing either all or nothing. Elaborate traps, decoys, and ambushes proved equally ineffective. It is hard to imagine our gourmet bête, rarely an animal eater, preferring a hard, cold, dead dog to a soft, warm, live milkmaid. Who would? The attacks did, however, taper off and finally cease at the height of the poisoning program. Like so many things connected with Libet, or bets, it is impossible to say what was effect and what was coincidence. By this time, things had gotten so bad that there is even record of dogs eating human bodies left by Libet, although the possibility was quickly ruled out that the basic mystery could be explained either by the activities of packs of wild dogs or by wolves acquiring cravings for human flesh. The local French called the wolves that ate human flesh carnivorous, although the ordinary sheep-eating ones could hardly be called vegetarian. Who stole my heart away? Whoever she was no maiden to choose for a good-night kiss, unless you have unusual tastes, or your new tax return is late. With her, the last waltz meant just that. She killed through sheer speed and surprise, not brute strength and boldness, evidencing a careful, professional judgment of risk against profit. The index-linked civil servants tried to prevent her from working, like they always feel compelled to do, with entrepreneurs, but she survived and kept them in jobs too. The church also was ostensibly against this working girl making an honest living, but she proved to be prayer-proof. For example, several churches were the rendezvous for processions of supplicants on August 18th and 19th, 1765, and other dates. Basile, Notre-Dame de Bellevue, Ventegus, Pébrac, and Paul-Lac, an old church probably destroyed in war, were some of them. There was ceremonial movement of icons of the Madonna between various churches, and some of them can still be seen in places to which they were delivered by the processions 200 years ago. Study of frequency and location of attacks, using computers and backs of envelopes, supports the contention that more than one beast prowled, but locals then and now reject the idea of several, although many reports exist of smaller animals seen both alone and with their mother. To the French, La Bête is an Edith Piaf, and will remain so. Both were unique stars with neighing voices and no regrets. On the other hand, who ever heard of a French lady lacking boyfriends? Joan of Arc possibly excepted. Perhaps the Wolvere, that burly but unaggressive Scottish werewolf allegedly seen in the Shetlands this century, should have been introduced to our fiery madame to cool her temper. By now, those farmers could be assailed by wicked Lady Macbeth, plus bairns playing bagpipes. Only French farmers deserve such suffering. It is best to laugh at dark corners. Another overseas candidate as La Bête, in addition to the legendary Nandi bear from Africa, who also had a penchant for rapid head removal, is the famous, mythical, and dangerous Canadian beast called the Wendigo. Elusive, frequents lonely forests, and loves children. A French-Canadian bet would, after all, be appropriate. The thylacine marsupial wolf of Tasmania, alive as recently as 1934, and still occasionally reported, for which a cooking recipe exists, no, not Vindaloo, is easily dismissed as too puny for the job. However, tails strong enough to knock people over were possessed by larger prehistoric carnivorous marsupials, like the thylacoleo. Such an unusual tail often appears in La Bête descriptions, as do other kangaroo-like features. Another Australian contender, although an unlikely one, being relatively small, is an animal still occasionally reported, but which probably became extinct in the 19th or early 20th century. This is the Tasmanian or Queensland tiger, the subject of a TV program which was marsupial and rather like a wolf with claws, probably resembling the extinct tiger dog of Japan, which is another possible but uninvestigated candidate. One report of La Bête describes a strange animal killed and buried in the Pinols region in July 1766. There had been deaths there since 1765. It was recorded by Curate Bergier, whose description resembles that of a very large baboon, but unfortunately only limited information is available, and the killings did not cease with the death of this beast. Crude drawings remain. Romulus and Remus were allegedly suckled by a wolf, so perhaps a human returned the compliment to an animal, which might explain where she obtained support, if any was needed. There are other accounts of humans being brought up by animals. Part of the Gévaudan area was renamed Aviron, shortly after the French Revolution in 1789. Books titled The Wild Boy of Aviron, who was allegedly a wolf child, were published in 1962 and 1976. Not previously recorded in the La Bête saga, registered here almost certainly for the first time in this context, is the fact that a strange and haunting drawing originated in Italy in 1495 of a woman monster with claws and horse-like head, washed up from the river Tiber. This is yet another unexplained beast story that had an effect on the Catholic Church. The idea that Lebet was a human-animal hybrid rears its particularly revolting head in some books. Such are reputed to have existed, almost all degenerate and shambling creatures. For example, there is even an obscure story that a man-beast monster was brought back by the Royal Navy and kept in secret on a small rocky islet off the south coast, being led around on a leash. Obviously not her, or it would have been Hello Sailor Burger. Such an aristocrat of killing as Lebet deserves to keep her thoroughbred reputation, not that of a monster from a horror comic. On January 29, 1997, the first edition of a Fortean TV series on the unexplained was broadcast by Channel 4. The program reported on a strange vampire-like beast, the goat sucker of Puerto Rico, nicknamed El Chupacabra. This creature has killed 150 goats in the Canavanas region by sucking their blood and liver through neat incisions in the neck. Other animals, cattle, rabbits, and chickens, have also been killed, but, so far, no humans. The Army has been called to investigate. Drawings from eyewitness reports show it to resemble no known animal, being kangaroo-like, fast, strong, and able to stand on 2 feet. Footprints of 3-clawed toes have been found at killing sites. The drawings and TV representations bear a resemblance to Lebet, who also was usually reported as first licking or sucking blood from victims, devouring them only afterwards. Reports have been received from U.S. and elsewhere of attacks on animals by similar beasts. On November 19, 1997, a program based on El Chupacabras, referred to as a weird creature in Mexican folklore, was broadcast in the X-Files series, but strayed from the original vampire-like monster legend, so evidence is sketchy. The animal, as reported, shows similarities to Lebet, but there are big differences. Its incisions are neat, whereas hers could be untidy. You can't call tearing off heads neat. It has been reported as having 3-clawed toes. She was not often reported with 3, but hers were also sometimes said to be clawed. If El Chupacabras ever graduates almost exclusively to humans, operates mainly in the daytime, and adopts less tidy eating habits, we can perhaps say Lebet has returned. According to the TV program, explanations considered include an alien or the outcome of genetic experiments at an American military base. These trains of thought mirror those which have taken place, so far unsuccessfully, over the last 230 years to explain Lebet. For example, the possibility that Lebet was an alien or caused by alien experiments has recently been studied in France, and views published. Closing scenes of the film Species show a female alien who, although furless, uncomfortably resembles Lebet in speed, style, and murderous intentions. Before dismissing the alien concept, remember that for over 2 centuries, clever people have unsuccessfully sought a solution to the Bet mystery. Under these circumstances, the apparently impossible must be admitted as a possibility. No, that is not quite what Sherlock Holmes said, although his comment is more perceptive and not so relevant. The classic black and white film The Night of the Demon has a large, unforgettable clawed monster, one of the best ever. Lebet can reasonably be described in appearance and behavior as a faster-moving mini version of this, and also resembles other traditional demons. Funny how our concept of wolf-like monsters has changed so little over the centuries, and is consistent worldwide. The Hindus believe in a terrible, blood-drinking feminine spirit called Kali, dedicated to destroying life to allow for recreation. She is sometimes represented as a clawed, hideous woman, and has been worshipped by Thuggees for more thousands of years than Christians have centuries. Victims are left with broken necks, mutilated, in shallow graves. To quote her fellow worker Shiva, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." In a hot Bengal night, the life recycling concept of Kali does not seem as unlikely as it does by a De Quincey-style Lake District fireside in November. Some writings about Lebet refer to mysterious caves, prehistoric bones, sometimes collected for fertilizer, and suspiciously knowledgeable individuals, But one question apparently never researched is whether any of the famous cave drawings and paintings in the area show an animal, of known or unknown species, that might have been Libet's ancestor. The recent discovery of important caves containing 20,000-year-old drawings of animals, ranging from rhinos to mammoths in the neighboring Vallon-Pointe-d'Arc region to the southeast to the direction from which she was first reported, gives food for thought. A famous Cro-Magnon cave painting of an odd, upright creature called the Sorcerer exists at Les Trois Frères. At nearby Le Moustier, there is a cave containing the world's earliest known ceremonial burial, that of a Neanderthal nicknamed Nandy. There is a museum at Chiac showing remains of animals going back 2.5 million years. Prehistoric people drew and fought animals which have become extinct, or have they, only since the council erected the new play area at Stonehenge. Like our own House of Lords, the Gévaudan district contains some of the world's best preserved and most numerous remnants of early intelligent human activity. Incidentally, she was last witnessed in September 1767 strolling peacefully along in Sarlat, also a prehistoric cave area. In establishing the identity of Libet, one apparently neglected information source is old family records. The use of surnames, especially those with titles, is particularly well controlled and documented in France, so the descendants of most people involved are traceable. Unpublished information hides for centuries in old drawers and teenage daughters' bedrooms. Pity the French never ask you home. Truth may sparkle one day to someone with long bar bill and pickled liver who, Western hero style, strides into local brassieres and asks questions, finally expiring as Libet's last victim, number 96 or 100 according to which statistics you accept. Liver, raw, no onions, was always her favorite entree, following a warm blood consommé, free lunch for the aristocrat of killing who dined royally in daylight. Plump leather tomes, written in comfortable Auvergne sunshine, expansively affirm she was not hyena, wolf, or human, but none tells what she damn well was. Entries on a postcard, please. No prizes, not after the blind dinner date. Sirsituha Sella. This will kill that, Victor Hugo. She last definitely killed on June 18th, 1767, at Dèche. Fittingly, her final victim is the unknown warrior, an unidentified little girl. Sadly, we can never know her name or if she was meant to bear 4 pretty children. All right, a paradox, but so is everything about Libet. Although there were outbreaks of killings by very similar beasts in the 17th and 19th centuries, after this last one, Libet, as Libet, vanishes from the world scene, although some husbands might reasonably claim to have married her. A meticulous and outstandingly elegant French hunting weapons book by Dominique Venet, a man, by the way, published in 1984, refers briefly but carefully to her on pages 113 and 114. English comments made at the time consist mainly of newspaper articles, indignantly recorded by Abbé Porchet in his famous book, which scathingly report that a French army of 12,000 had been routed by a beast. Some beast! It is surprising so little has been written on Libet outside France when you consider her splendid achievements as a serial killer. Jack the Ripper officially killed only 5 victims, all women over a period of 10 autumn weeks, not as foggy as films depict, whereas she often had a mixed bag of 4 or 5 within a single week. For example, during a snowy 1st to 7th January 1765, and another 95 over 3 years, once killing 2 and maiming 1 on a midsummer's solstice. As usual, the French do it better, and she elegantly beat Jack's score by nearly a century not out. No doubt would have killed JR too, given 1 demi-chance. One of the few considered English comments appears in Walking Through France by Nyon on pages 142 and 155. The dates he mentions are confusing and apparently incorrect, suggesting bet activity as far back as 1745, which is earlier than elsewhere recorded. He describes Saint-Jury, where he stayed as being ravaged by both Lebet in 1764 and in 1944 by the Waffen SS from the Das Reich division. Even in 1988, Nyon admits he was glad to be sleeping within the friendly claw-proof walls of the Hôtel de Besse, and not outside under thin canvas. Incidentally, a Monsieur Besse of Bessières wrote a manuscript on sighting and chase of December 23, 1767, by a young subaltern called Dulaurier. He had just drawn his saber to strike Lebet when she jumped over a wall and ran across a marsh where his horse could not follow. A 1992 expensive Canadian book, Wolf Hunting in France in the Reign of Louis XV, by R.H. Thompson, deals extensively with Lebet, contending that there can be satisfactory explanations based on large wolves for all her depredations. On the other hand, Denneval, a Norman squire known for his surly directness, recognized as the greatest wolf expert in the 18th century France and having the advantage of actually being in charge on the spot, firmly and officially asserted that there was indeed something very strange going on in Gévaudan, and that, quote, Lebet is no wolf, unquote. Perhaps that was just because he couldn't catch it. Which one do we believe? Another recent article writer, C.H.D. Clarke, is an expert in North American wolves. Firstly, he reprimands those who refer to Lebet as a legend, strongly pointing out that she was definitely no legend, but was hard fact and really existed. His second important observation is, quote, the certainty that no rabies was involved meant that there was something going on that was without precedent, unquote. Rabid wolf attacks are clumsy compared with Lebet's elegant handbaggings. He considers that one explanation of Lebet is there was more than one, and they resulted from a natural crossbreeding between large dog, possibly of an Italian hunting breed, and wild wolf. His explanation for the Bet phenomenon is supported by reports published elsewhere of vigorous hybrids between wolf and large dog. For example, the wolf of Argenton, killed in 1884. Another candidate for crossbreeding with wolf might be the Lycaon, a carnivorous wild hunting dog still active and feared in Africa. It is perhaps a little small, but is very savage and cunning. A cross with the wolf would be a formidable animal, and a litter of them loose in a district could well be taken as an abnormal phenomenon. The presence of African animals in the Gévaudan is recorded in cave drawings over thousands of years, and even today there are attempts to re-establish them in large game parks. Clarke has noticed the connections between the works of Grimm, Stevenson, and Lebet. Grimm apparently was a friend of Rousseau. A poem was written on the famous fight between Portefaix, protecting his 6 child companions, and Lebet on January 12, 1765, at Villeray-d'Apcher. Robert Louis Stevenson possibly based his beautiful shepherdess stories on a girl from Pololac who was killed by her. Clarke quotes 21 references in his study. What coincidental patterns she weaves. For example, Stevenson carefully includes her in his famous Travels with a Donkey and the Savant, written in 1879, in particular admiring her bravery in attacking in daylight a party of couriers armed with pistols and swords. His summation is incomparable. Quote, if all wolves had been as this wolf, they would have changed the history of man, unquote. Then, by 1886, he writes Jekyll and Hyde. We will never know if his werewolf-like theme, changing, hairy hands, etc., was based on Lebet, but it is reasonable to conclude that she played a part. The book opened as a play in London in 1888, just as Jack the Ripper simultaneously started his, compared with Lebet, meager series of 5 murders. In the war, German troops destroyed 2 villages where Lebet prowled, and a chance German bomb on Bournemouth hit the house in which Stevenson had died. Some further examples of what we call coincidences. The old oak table on which this article has been written was made by Filmer Sons, Burner Street, for the home of Dr. Langdon Down, who described Down syndrome in 1866. His Kingston-upon-Thames mansion, Normansfield, became and still is a hospital. Some say the Ripper was a medical man. An alley off Burner Street is where Elizabeth Stride died of a severed windpipe, and Burner Street itself was a center of Ripper activity. Incidentally, burner is an old French verb for to mock or make fun of. Some do say the Ripper, usually described as about 5 feet 7 inches tall, was a woman. There was talk of Jill the Ripper at the time, and who had more motive for killing those sad, loose ladies than someone whose husband or son had been ruined by them. Confusing, but can we admit the concept of infinite situations created to allow all possible connections? A long way from our simple bet, or is it? Only a god could create such a complicated and extensive system, so perhaps Gabriel Florent, wordy Bishop of Mende, was not wrong after all when he, like Abbé Porcher, referred to her in his famous mandate as, quote, the scourge of God, unquote, and attributed supernatural, indeed heavenly powers to her. Another author apparently influenced by Libet was Jacob Ludwig Grimm of Brothers Grimm fame, who published Red Riding Hood as Rotkapshan in approximately 1812, a work recognized as having deep significance. He had been librarian to Jerome Bonaparte, being expert in antiquities and mythology. Not that Libet was a myth. Her all the better to eat you with was backed up by real teeth. Incidentally, the first clearly recorded Red Riding Hood fairy story is attributed to a Frenchman, Charles Perrault, a great classical historian. It appeared in his book Stories of Times Past in 1697. The famous Nostradamus, in spite of his Latinized pen name, was a Frenchman named Michel de Nostradame, born 1503 in Provence, who spent most of his life studying, working in, and traveling between places later associated with Libet, such as Avignon. Libet was widely reported in the Avignon Gazette. And Montpellier, the city from which the military hunt for Libet was directed by the Count of Montcalm, a cautious but capable organizer, who handled very delicately an official request that the local population be armed against Libet with weapons from his arsenals. One of Nostradamus's prophecies for mid-18th century France states, quote, Mars threatens us with the belligerent force. Blood will be made to spread out 70 times. The church will grow, suffer harm, and more to those who would listen to nothing of them, unquote. Not too far out, was he? Especially as there is nothing else obviously relevant to this particular prophecy. Allow him another one. Quote, the lost thing hidden for so many centuries is discovered. Pasteur will be honored almost as demigod. Dishonor shall come by other winds when the moon finishes her great cycle, unquote. Be careful with that cloning. In the Place des Cordiers, Machival, there is, by the sculptor Henri Coste, a contemporary-style statue bringing out her cunning brutality, but Libet was never seen there, so why they have a statue is another mystery. Perhaps they are jealous of the towns and villages she really did haunt. Mon Dieu! They have une bête and we do not! Shades of Clochemurel. The inscription claims the statue to be her, but in fact it is of only the deformed animal killed by Jean Chastel. So perhaps it is just a cunning, spoiling act. They even held a bête exhibition in the Mairie, the town hall, at Mauvais-Jol in 1958. Those French. The church at Saint-Albin-sur-Lamignon has Libet as its weathercock. In memoriam, as in life, she remains inaccessible and knows just which way the wind is blowing. Most parts of the world take particular stories or legends to heart, hero or beast, distilling them out from all the rest to reflect exactly the character of the country. In England, we have King Arthur and Robin Hood. In America, they have Mickey Mouse and Davy Crockett. In France, Libet is still alive because she represents the tough Auvergne landscape and its independent people who often have had to fight occupying troops and oppressive bureaucracy. Maybe it's not too late for her to take an evening stroll around the streets of expense-account restaurants in Brussels. Bon appétit, bet. Well, what do you think she was? The question bet students fear. It always feels undignified and rude simply to answer, I don't know. Some modern experts in wolves who never hunted her think she must have been a wolf, but hunters on the spot at the time held very different opinions, as did the cripples suffering in squalor and poverty from her blurringly fast, wide-ranging attacks. Any article on Lebet would be incomplete unless it clearly stated the opinion of Abbé Pierre Pouchet, the meticulous author of by far the greatest and longest book on the subject. Pouchet's interpretation of the mystery is entirely religiously based, sober, and critical. His concept is, Lebet was probably just the deformed, wolf-like animal killed by Jean Chastel in 1767, but that it had been aided by God as a scourge to correct human wickedness, being brought on specifically by bad behavior and unacceptable changes in church ritual. This heavenly aid, not her being a monster, explained to Pouchet her power and invulnerability. He repeats several times that she was something very abnormal. Quote, "Her cunning, skill, and mobility, even her very existence, were completely beyond human understanding." Unquote. There are many different views on what she was. About 20 books have been written, and most of the other authors do not agree with Pouchet, although the highly respected Gabriel Ferrand, Bishop of Mende at the time of Lebet, did. There are also differing opinions among authors on Lebet as to the character of the Chastels, father and son. Pouchet records Jean Chastel as being a man of very good character, whereas, for example, Chevalier, in his semi-fictional novel, regards him with suspicion, even to the extent of surmising he might have been involved in some deception or crossbreeding involving hyena. It is alleged he had been a prisoner and tortured in the Middle East. Incidentally, the hyena species, which hunts as much as it scavenges, is genetically more similar to cat than dog, being of the feline family Feliodea, which certainly opens up the possibility of a terribly formidable crossbreed, such as hyena and big cat. In any event, the Chastel name is closely associated with the Lebet mystery, but whether for good or evil has never become clear. To answer a difficult question like the identity of Lebet, try shooting sighting shots at the two extremes and hope your third shot lands, German Navy style, correctly in the middle. At one extreme, let us say she never existed, being only rumor arising from attacks by a few large wolves, which may have been crossbred or deformed, and arise in cases of rabies. The Jesuits may have invented her to shepherd members of their flock back into loyalty to the Church, which was under political pressure from 1761 onwards. Some Huguenots, terribly persecuted and almost wiped out by the Jesuits in the past, welcomed her as an excuse to be armed. Hotheads of all types used her, ultimately successfully, to foment revolution. Even Louis XV might have taken advantage of the opportunity to send his troops to an increasingly unruly district. All these possibilities have been repeatedly analyzed in literature on Lebet. On the other hand, we have graves and 100 corpses, a lot compared with the modest scores of most serial killers. We have hundreds, maybe thousands, of individual and collective eyewitnessings, sometimes by whole dioceses en masse. Intelligent French people of all ranks reporting to every type of state and religious bodies. We have a vast quantity of manuscripts, diagrams, and other records authenticated by the highest possible religious, military, and state bodies, and by respected individuals, such as ministers, dukes, and generals. Conspirators probably could not have murdered 100 people over 4 years and fabricated all the evidence without being suspected at least once. The more likely situation is that all the parties took what advantage they could of the existence of a real beast rather than inventing one when there was no need to. At the other extreme, we could accept that she was something unique in recorded human experience, an alien, mutant, or surviving prehistoric monster. Only such explanations fully satisfy the records of her speed, elusiveness, and cunning. You can, of course, choose to dismiss Lebet as merely a large wolf, but you will find those two very uncomfortable words, "and yet," keep coming to mind. It is for the reader to decide from the unbiased information honestly presented here and any obtainable from other sources, where between the two extremes the truth lies. Nus nicht den Teufel an die Wand malen. Talk of the devil, and he will appear. Whatever it or she was, something strong, fast, and clever painted the French countryside red 2 centuries ago without being caught. A warning, perhaps, against genetically creating intelligent beings who regard humans as free lunches, not lords of creation. To the explanation for this particular naughty lady of shady lanes, the only limitation is your imagination. After 200 years, just a faint echo remains of the terrible shadow Lebet cast in the 18th century. So should she still be feared? Walk thoughtfully alone in a darkening wood, or on misty Bodmin Moor, and find the answer. When twigs crack, don't whistle. Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open now.